The night was silent, but the shadows seemed alive. In the flickering light of a solitary torch, the edges of an ancient chamber shimmered with secrets long hidden from the world. Dust motes danced like tiny specters, caught between the wavering glow and the darkness beyond. The air smelled faintly of parchment and resin, the unmistakable scent of a place forgotten by time. Here, in the hidden recesses beneath what was once a bustling city, a collection of scrolls, engraved stones, and cryptic manuscripts lay in solemn silence, untouched for centuries. Each item seemed to hum with a quiet power, as if the very essence of the past was contained within them, whispering to those patient enough to listen. These relics were not merely remnants of history. They belonged to an order so secretive, so carefully erased from the annals of time, that even the most devoted scholars doubted its existence. They spoke in hushed tones of the Order of Solomon, a clandestine brotherhood shrouded in mystery, born out of devotion, ambition, and a singular obsession with the sacred. Not knights in shining armor, not political pawns, but custodians of something far greater than wealth or power, a truth that could shake the foundations of history itself. The stories of the order were fragmented, scattered across centuries and continents like shards of a broken mirror. Some fragments appeared in the obscure chronicles of monasteries, hidden within the margins of texts that most eyes had never seen. Others emerged in whispered legends of crusaders, travelers, and mystics who had glimpsed the order's influence without ever comprehending it fully. Even the grandest libraries, filled with meticulously catalogued knowledge, held only hints. A symbol etched in stone, a name inscribed in a forgotten language, a cryptic reference that seemed almost deliberately designed to mislead. It was said that the members of this order were the true inheritors of Solomon's wisdom, custodians of secrets passed down from the legendary king himself. Solomon, the ruler renowned for his unparalleled understanding of the natural and spiritual worlds, had built a temple not only as a place of worship, but as a repository of divine knowledge. Within its walls lay objects and writings imbued with meaning far beyond mortal comprehension. To those who knew the symbols, every geometric line, every sacred diagram, every carefully crafted verse contained instructions, principles, and hidden knowledge that could alter the course of nations. And it was this knowledge that the Order of Solomon dedicated their lives to preserving. The origins of the order were obscured by time. Some claimed they were founded by the surviving priests and scribes of the first temple after its destruction, escaping with fragments of the sacred knowledge to safeguard it against invaders and despots. Others suggested that the order had roots even deeper, extending into the mythic histories of ancient civilizations, drawing upon wisdom from Egypt, Babylon, and beyond. What was clear, however, was that this order had existed in the shadows, influencing events, shaping minds, and guiding those deemed worthy, all while remaining invisible to the eyes of the uninitiated. One could imagine the first members, cloaked in modest robes, moving silently through candlelit corridors, their faces shadowed, their hands tracing the worn edges of scrolls that had survived centuries of conquest and fire. They would gather in chambers that smelled of incense and ancient ink, where the walls themselves seemed to hold memory. Each initiation into the order was said to be a rite of both revelation and endurance, testing the resolve, faith, and intellect of the aspirant. Few were deemed worthy, and even fewer survived the trials intact. Those who succeeded were entrusted not just with knowledge, but with a sacred responsibility, to protect the truths that, if misused or revealed prematurely, could bring devastation to the unprepared world. Legends spoke of their methods, peculiar and enigmatic to outsiders. They communicated in coded symbols, in gestures, in allegorical stories designed to obscure as much as to teach. Their texts were layered with meaning, often written in multiple languages, each word chosen to conceal and reveal simultaneously. A casual observer might see only a collection of philosophical musings or theological speculation, but those who understood the subtle patterns could uncover strategies, maps, and insights into the spiritual and natural laws that govern the world. The secrecy was not merely practical. It was essential. Throughout history, knowledge had been both a weapon and a threat. Those who possessed it could reshape kingdoms, alter religions, and command loyalty or fear. And yet, History had shown repeatedly that the unguarded dissemination of such wisdom could lead to catastrophe. Wars had been fought over fragments of it, lives lost in the pursuit of artifacts, and entire civilizations upended by those who misunderstood or abused what they did not fully comprehend. The Order of Solomon understood this, and their vigilance was relentless. Even in the present, echoes of the order could be found in unexpected places. A carved motif on a cathedral pillar, a peculiar ritual in a distant monastery, or a recurring symbol in medieval manuscripts, each could hint at the invisible hand of a group that had survived through centuries of secrecy. These subtle traces suggested not only a remarkable endurance but also an adaptability that allowed the order to thrive even as empires rose and fell, and as kings and popes sought to control every aspect of the spiritual and temporal worlds. There was, however, a tension inherent in the order's existence: the danger of discovery. Throughout history, powerful men coveted knowledge they could not understand. Ambition, fear, and envy led to betrayals, accusations, and violent suppression. In such an environment, trust was scarce, and loyalty was tested in ways unimaginable to ordinary humans. Every scroll hidden in a secret chamber, every coded message sent across borders, was a gamble. The cost of failure could be life itself, or worse, the loss of wisdom never to be recovered. It is perhaps this precariousness that gives the story of the Order of Solomon its haunting beauty. Unlike the grand tales of kings and battles, the story of this order is not written in victory or conquest, but in resilience, patience, and faith. It is the story of men and women who walked the fine line between revelation and concealment, who understood that true power lies not in domination, but in stewardship. And it is the story of secrets that may have shaped the course of history without ever being acknowledged, secrets that continue to linger just beyond the reach of our understanding. One could spend a lifetime searching for proof, wandering through dusty archives and crumbling ruins, yet the essence of the order may never fully reveal itself. Perhaps that is the point. Some truths are meant to be glimpsed only fleetingly, like a candle flickering in a darkened hall, visible for a moment before vanishing once again. And yet, the pull of curiosity is irresistible. The thought that somewhere, hidden beneath layers of time, lies knowledge that could change everything is both exhilarating and terrifying. It is a story that beckons with a quiet insistence, a siren call to those who dare to look beyond the surface of history. As the night deepened, the chamber remained silent, holding its secrets with an almost sentient patience. The torchlight flickered one last time before settling into a steady glow, revealing more of the enigmatic symbols etched into stone walls. One could almost hear the whispers of the past, the voices of the Order of Solomon calling across centuries. And somewhere in the shadows, just out of reach, the greatest secret awaited, one that had survived wars, betrayals, and the erosion of time itself. It was a secret not merely of treasure or power, but of truth, knowledge, and the extraordinary human desire to seek what is hidden. The question remained, what did they guard so fiercely that the world might never fully understand? And more importantly, was anyone truly ready to discover it? Long before the first whispers of the Templars, long before crusaders carried banners across burning landscapes, there was a king whose name resonated with power, wisdom, and mystery: Solomon. He ruled not merely with authority but with insight that seemed to touch the divine. Stories of his intellect and judgment were etched into the chronicles of history, but beneath the surface of these celebrated tales lay a deeper, almost imperceptible truth. Solomon was not just a monarch. He was a custodian of secrets, a man entrusted with knowledge that transcended his time. Legends suggest that within the walls of his magnificent temple, carefully hidden from prying eyes, lay treasures beyond imagination. Not just gold and silver, but wisdom so profound it could bend the course of human understanding. The Temple of Solomon, often romanticized in paintings and prose, was far more than a house of worship. To the initiated, it was a repository of divine law, sacred geometry, and esoteric principles. Every pillar, every mosaic, and every hidden chamber held meaning, encoded for those trained to see beyond the obvious. Ancient texts suggest that the temple contained objects of staggering significance. The Ark of the Covenant, inscribed tablets of divine instruction, and artifacts said to channel energy that bridged the human and spiritual worlds. Yet these treasures were not meant for the masses. They were safeguarded by the faithful, protected from those who might wield them without understanding. The destruction of Solomon's temple marked a rupture not only in the spiritual heart of a nation but also in the continuity of sacred knowledge. When invaders swept through Jerusalem, looting and fire reduced stone and timber to rubble, many believed that the secrets within were lost forever. But whispers persisted. Fragments of knowledge survived, smuggled out by priests, scribes, and mystics who understood their value. They carried with them scrolls, coded manuscripts, and artifacts, scattering across lands and into the hands of those willing to protect them in secrecy. The survival of these fragments became the foundation for secretive societies that would rise and fall in the centuries to come, their existence often only hinted at in obscure writings or cryptic legends. The allure of Solomon's wisdom was not merely religious or philosophical. It was practical, even revolutionary. The king's understanding of governance, law, and human behavior went beyond his era, providing a blueprint for societies yet unborn. He codified principles of justice that balanced mercy and authority, laying a foundation that would echo through legal systems millennia later. But perhaps more compelling were the hidden aspects. Knowledge of the cosmos, numerical systems, celestial patterns, and rituals that connected human intention with the unseen forces of the universe. This was the knowledge that the Order of Solomon sought to protect, the inheritance that would one day find its way into the hands of the Templars. Stories of the Order's custodianship suggest an almost ritualistic dedication to secrecy. Those who served as guardians were not merely scholars. They were initiates, trained to decode symbols, memorize texts, and interpret patterns invisible to the ordinary eye. They moved through the world like shadows, leaving subtle traces of their presence. A symbol carved into a stone, a coded mark on a manuscript, or the arrangement of objects in a ritual that seemed meaningless to the untrained observer. Every action was deliberate, designed to obscure the truth from the unworthy while ensuring its survival across generations. The question of why such care was necessary is both simple and profound. Knowledge, in the wrong hands, can be a weapon as devastating as any army. Throughout history, those who coveted wisdom often sought it with violence, corruption, or manipulation. Kings and emperors waged wars for artifacts. Religious leaders condemned texts that threatened their authority. Invaders destroyed libraries to erase evidence of intellectual or spiritual progress. Solomon's order understood that survival depended not merely on physical protection but on obscurity, on moving in the margins where only the initiated could follow. The mystique of Solomon's hidden legacy was amplified by the very secrecy surrounding it. Unlike ordinary rulers whose histories were etched in stone and scrolls for the world to see, the king's most profound achievements existed in layers: a visible history and an invisible, guarded reality. Legends suggest that the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred artifact in all of Israel, was more than a symbol of divine favor. It was a repository of knowledge, a vessel of power, a tool that could illuminate the mind and spirit. The precise nature of its secrets remains unknown, but throughout history, countless groups have claimed to glimpse its influence, and many have dedicated themselves to uncovering its truths, often at great peril. It is within this context that the Order of Solomon emerges, not as a mythical creation, but as a necessary continuation of a lost line of wisdom. They were not conquerors or rulers. They were scholars, priests, and warriors united by a single mission: to ensure that Solomon's knowledge survived intact, that it would endure despite the destruction of temples, the ravages of time, and the ambitions of those who would misuse it. The methods of the order were enigmatic: initiation rites that tested the body, mind, and spirit, symbols embedded in texts and architecture, rituals that seemed arcane yet held deep meaning for those trained to interpret them. Each generation was both student and protector, a link in an unbroken chain stretching from the king himself to the distant future. The emotional weight of this legacy cannot be overstated. Imagine being entrusted with knowledge that could transform empires, reshape faith, or illuminate the human soul, but knowing that revealing it prematurely could bring ruin. For the members of the order, loyalty was both a sacred obligation and a profound burden. Betrayal was unthinkable. Mistakes were potentially catastrophic. And yet, human frailty was ever present. Rivalries, doubts, and fears arose within the very walls meant to protect this wisdom, reminding us that even the most devoted custodians are not immune to the pressures of mortality. And yet, there is an undeniable beauty in their dedication. Their story is not one of conquest or spectacle, but of patience, resilience, and quiet heroism. While empires crumbled and wars consumed nations, these keepers of knowledge moved silently, ensuring that what was precious survived. Their actions were almost invisible, yet their impact was profound. For in safeguarding the legacy of Solomon, they preserved a thread of wisdom that would eventually resurface in ways that changed the world. It is perhaps inevitable that curiosity surrounds such mysteries. What exactly did Solomon's order protect? What wisdom did they pass down? And why did it take centuries for these fragments to resurface in forms more recognizable to the outside world, eventually influencing the Templars? Scholars and historians have debated these questions endlessly, piecing together evidence from obscure texts, architectural clues, and cryptic inscriptions. Yet much remains speculative, a tantalizing puzzle that invites both wonder and frustration. The thrill lies not only in the potential answers but in the journey through shadows, through fragments, through the faint echoes of voices long silenced. The legacy of Solomon is therefore not confined to legend or scripture. It lives on in the subtle influence of ideas, in structures, rituals, and secretive orders that have persisted long after the stones of the temple crumbled. The knowledge may have been hidden, fragmented, and obscured, yet it is not lost. In the hands of those who were willing to seek, interpret, and protect it, the legacy became immortal, a bridge between the past and the distant future. And so, the story of Solomon is not simply a tale of kings and temples. It is the story of humanity's relentless pursuit of truth, the devotion required to protect it, and the peril inherent in wielding it. It is the story that sets the stage for the emergence of the Templars, a group that, centuries later, would inherit not only the mystique, but the sacred responsibility of guarding what few could understand. As the echoes of Solomon's wisdom spread through time, one question remains, haunting and persistent. What did the king truly know, and what did those who followed him in secret carry into the shadows of history, waiting for the right moment to reemerge? The fall of Solomon's temple was more than a physical destruction. It was the shattering of a spiritual and intellectual epicenter, an event whose repercussions rippled across centuries in ways that few could comprehend. The once majestic sanctuary, adorned with gilded pillars and intricate carvings, had been a beacon of divine wisdom, a place where the mortal and the sacred intersected. Its destruction was swift, violent, and complete, or so it seemed. For while the invaders claimed the spoils and reduced the building to rubble, fragments of its knowledge, carefully guarded, slipped through the cracks of history, carried by those who understood that some truths were too precious to perish. As the smoke of the fallen city mingled with the morning haze, whispers began to circulate among the faithful. Priests and scribes, who had long studied the temple's hidden chambers, vanished into the countryside, carrying with them scrolls, tablets, and sacred objects. Each step they took was measured, deliberate, a silent race against time to ensure the survival of knowledge that could, if lost, remain lost forever. The streets of Jerusalem, once bustling with devotion and commerce, now echoed with the cries of the defeated and the hurried whispers of those who fled with secrets too dangerous to expose. Among them, the seeds of a clandestine network were sown, an order devoted not to conquest or fame, but to the preservation of the sacred. These survivors were not merely scholars or clerics. They were custodians of a heritage that defied destruction. In the dim light of hidden chambers, they cataloged texts, etched symbols into stone, and devised intricate codes to shield their knowledge from those who might misuse it. What they carried was not simply religious doctrine. It was a philosophy, a science of the sacred, a means of understanding the cosmos and humanity's place within it. Each fragment was a thread in a tapestry so complex that only those trained in the discipline of secrecy could perceive the full picture. And yet, even in their careful concealment, they understood the danger. Discovery could bring death, and betrayal could mean the loss of knowledge for generations. Over time, these secretive movements coalesced into what some historians now speculate were proto-orders, precursors to the famed Knights Templar. Unlike ordinary religious groups, these proto-orders operated in shadows, their presence often hinted at only through cryptic symbols, allegorical texts, or subtle architectural motifs. They were disciples of wisdom, not of power, protectors of knowledge, not conquerors of lands. And yet, the influence of their work would eventually reach far beyond the confines of hidden chambers, shaping the moral, spiritual, and even political landscape of Europe in ways no one could have predicted. The transmission of this knowledge was painstaking and perilous. Without modern preservation techniques, each text, each scroll, each carefully inscribed tablet risked decay, theft, or destruction. Yet the custodians persevered, often traveling under the cover of night, moving from city to city, monastery to monastery, palace to palace, leaving traces so subtle that only the most observant could detect them. They embedded instructions in geometry, concealed wisdom within allegorical tales, and sometimes encoded messages in rituals that appeared, to the casual observer, to be purely ceremonial. Every act of concealment was also an act of devotion. Every step taken to protect the knowledge was a testament to the gravity of their mission. The historical record provides glimpses of these efforts, though always incomplete. Some chronicles speak of mysterious travelers arriving at remote monasteries, bearing scrolls written in languages no scholar had seen before. Others describe cryptic symbols carved into the stonework of early churches and synagogues, suggesting that knowledge had been hidden in plain sight, visible only to those who knew where and how to look. Each fragment, each whisper of an order that moved unseen, reinforced the idea that while empires could be destroyed, wisdom could endure, provided it had protectors willing to risk everything for its survival. One of the most enduring mysteries lies in the question of what exactly these guardians sought to preserve. It was not merely gold, jewels, or relics of tangible value. It was something far more profound, a framework of understanding that could illuminate the human mind and spirit, a system of knowledge connecting morality, mathematics, the heavens, and the unseen forces that governed life. Some historians argue that what survived in these secretive networks laid the groundwork for mystical traditions, early esoteric sciences, and even the spiritual practices that would later influence the Templars. Others suggest that the knowledge was so advanced, so dangerous, that it required centuries of careful transmission before it could be safely revealed, if ever. The fragility of these networks cannot be overstated. Political upheaval, conquest, and religious persecution constantly threatened their existence. Empires rose and fell around them, often unaware that within the shadows, a thread of continuity persisted. Those who carried the knowledge were forced to adapt, to disguise themselves, and to create layers of secrecy that would protect their mission across generations. Yet, for all the precautions, the possibility of loss remained ever present. A single betrayal, a single careless revelation, could undo centuries of careful preservation. The stakes were nothing less than the survival of wisdom itself. Even in exile, the members of these proto-orders maintained a delicate balance between concealment and influence. They could not act openly, yet they sought to guide events subtly, ensuring that those prepared to receive fragments of knowledge were nurtured while the unworthy remained unaware. Their methods were often indistinguishable from coincidence, their guidance woven into the fabric of history so subtly that only later generations could discern the patterns. It is in this delicate interplay between hidden influence and public invisibility that the true genius of these early custodians becomes apparent. Perhaps most remarkable of all is the endurance of their symbols and ideas. Even as the centuries passed, the motifs, allegories, and coded messages left by these early keepers resurfaced in unexpected ways, sometimes in architecture, sometimes in manuscripts, and sometimes in the rituals of later orders. It is no coincidence that the Templars, centuries later, would inherit not only the mystical allure of Solomon's legacy, but also the methods of concealment and transmission perfected by these early guardians. They inherited a framework that allowed them to combine spiritual devotion with martial discipline, secrecy with influence, and devotion with action in ways the outside world could scarcely understand. And yet, For all their success in preserving the knowledge, a sense of tragedy lingered. The destruction of the temple had scattered not only sacred objects but also fragments of human understanding. Whole sections of wisdom may have been lost forever, leaving only tantalizing hints of what once was. For those who later encountered remnants of these secrets, there was always the haunting awareness that the knowledge might be incomplete, that the full picture, the ultimate truth, was just beyond reach. This awareness gave the Order's work an almost sacred melancholy, a recognition that their mission was endless, their goal unattainable in its entirety, and yet too important to abandon. As the years passed, the survivors and their descendants continued to move through the world like shadows, safeguarding what they could while laying the groundwork for the emergence of new orders. The Order of Solomon, though largely forgotten, left indelible traces that would later be felt in the rise of the Templars, who carried forward not only a martial tradition but a mystical inheritance, a continuity of purpose that connected the grandeur of Solomon's era with the fervor of the Crusades. In this way, the fall of the temple did not mark the end of a legacy. It marked the beginning of a journey, a transfer of sacred responsibility from one generation to the next. In contemplating this hidden lineage, one cannot help but feel a mixture of awe and melancholy. Empires crumble, wars destroy cities, and kings die, yet ideas, when carefully nurtured, persist. The fall of Solomon's temple was a tragedy, but it was also a catalyst, forcing the survivors into exile and secrecy, compelling them to protect knowledge with a vigilance that would echo through the centuries. And so, in the quiet corners of history, away from the eyes of conquerors and chroniclers, a subtle but profound thread endured, an inheritance of wisdom, patience, and devotion that would shape the spiritual and intellectual landscape of the world in ways still being uncovered today. The question that lingers, haunting and insistent, is the same one that has captivated generations. What precisely survived the fall? What knowledge, what wisdom, what sacred truths were carried into exile, hidden from the world yet preserved against time and destruction? And perhaps most tantalizing of all, how did this secret knowledge shape the orders, the warriors, and the mystics who would later rise to prominence, ensuring that the legacy of Solomon's wisdom would never vanish entirely, even in the face of overwhelming loss? Centuries after the fall of Solomon's temple, the world had shifted in ways both violent and subtle. Kingdoms rose and fell, wars scarred the landscape, and the echoes of ancient wisdom seemed to drift further from human memory. Yet, in the shadow of these upheavals, a new force was quietly emerging, one that would transform the guardianship of sacred knowledge into something tangible, disciplined, and militarized. The Knights Templar were born not merely as protectors of pilgrims journeying to the Holy Land, but as heirs to a legacy steeped in secrecy, devotion, and a hidden inheritance that reached back to the very heart of Solomon's wisdom. The First Crusade had ended decades earlier, leaving the Holy Land fractured but newly accessible to Western pilgrims. These travelers, often wealthy and unarmed, faced the perils of deserts, bandits, and hostile territories. In response to their vulnerability, a group of knights emerged in Jerusalem, modest in number but extraordinary in vision. They pledged themselves to a dual mission: to defend pilgrims on their journey and to serve a higher, spiritual purpose. Their early days were humble. They possessed little more than simple armor, rudimentary weapons, and a fervent devotion to their cause. Yet, beneath this outward simplicity lay the stirrings of something unprecedented, a blend of martial discipline and mystical aspiration that would become the hallmark of the order. The connection to Solomon's legacy was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. The Templars were not initially aware of the full scope of the knowledge they had inherited, but traces of the ancient order's influence were embedded in their rituals, symbols, and teachings. The red cross stitched into their robes, the geometric patterns within their chapels, and the coded texts they began to study all hinted at a deeper, concealed lineage. It was as though the wisdom of Solomon had lain dormant, waiting for a generation capable of blending spiritual discipline with the practical skills required to survive and protect in a turbulent world. Their reputation grew rapidly. Pilgrims spoke of knights who appeared like shadows along treacherous roads, armed yet measured, imposing yet merciful. The order's structure was disciplined and deliberate. Every member was required to take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet the most important obligation was secrecy, the promise to safeguard knowledge that transcended mortal concerns. Within this framework, the Templars became more than soldiers. They became custodians of a heritage that, while still partially veiled, carried echoes of a wisdom centuries old. They were the inheritors of a hidden lineage, tasked with protecting not just lives but truths that the world might not be ready to receive. The order's influence expanded far beyond the streets of Jerusalem. As their numbers grew, so too did their responsibilities. They established fortified residences, known as preceptories, throughout the Holy Land, each one a hub of strategic, spiritual, and intellectual activity. Within these walls, the knights trained rigorously in combat, studied sacred texts, and engaged in discussions about morality, law, and the unseen forces that shaped the world. Their libraries, though modest in the beginning, began to accumulate manuscripts, scrolls, and objects imbued with meaning, some of which were believed to originate directly from the remnants of Solomon's temple. These collections became both a source of power and a magnet for envy, intrigue, and fear, drawing the attention of kings, clergy, and scholars alike. It was during this period that the Templars began to develop a reputation that was almost mythical. Tales of their courage in battle spread across Europe, alongside stories of their unwavering faith and secretive practices. Rumors circulated that they possessed knowledge beyond that of ordinary men, knowledge of hidden paths, of sacred geometries, and of divine law. Some whispered that the order had access to artifacts of extraordinary power, relics that connected them to the wisdom of ancient kings. While such stories were often dismissed as exaggeration, they served to reinforce the sense that the Templars were not merely knights. They were the living embodiment of a continuity that stretched back to Solomon himself. The duality of their existence was striking. On one hand, they were formidable warriors, trained to face enemies in open battle, unflinching in the defense of pilgrims and the faithful. On the other, they were seekers, delving into mysteries that transcended the material world, deciphering symbols and texts whose meaning remained obscure to the outside observer. This combination of strength and subtlety, of action and contemplation, set them apart from every other order of their time. They were disciplined yet secretive, devout yet inquisitive, capable of immense courage and profound insight in equal measure. The order's rise also brought political entanglements that would shape its destiny. European monarchs recognized the utility of such a disciplined, wealthy, and strategically positioned group, while the papacy saw in the Templars an instrument of both faith and control. Yet, for all the external attention and intrigue, the order maintained its core mission: protection, devotion, and the safeguarding of knowledge. Even as they navigated alliances, rivalries, and the ever-present threat of betrayal, the Templars never lost sight of the invisible inheritance they had received, the wisdom whose roots extended deep into the ancient past. It is perhaps in their rituals and symbols that the influence of Solomon is most apparent. The geometric patterns in Templar architecture, the secrecy of their initiation rites, and the layered meanings of their texts all suggest an awareness of knowledge far older than their own order. The initiation process, rigorous and demanding, was designed not merely to test courage but to cultivate insight. Knights were trained to observe, to interpret, and to act with discernment, skills that were as necessary for the protection of wisdom as for the defense of pilgrims. The symbols they employed were not decorative. They were functional, encoding information and guiding those capable of reading it toward a deeper understanding. By the middle of the 12th century, the Templars had evolved from a small band of protectors into an organization that combined martial, spiritual, and intellectual authority. They were disciplined, feared, and respected. Yet, despite their outward success, the true measure of their power remained invisible. It was not in the wealth they accumulated, nor in the castles they built, nor in the armies they commanded. It was in their ability to safeguard knowledge, to carry forward the legacy of a wisdom almost erased by history, and to transmit it through the generations in ways that were deliberate, concealed, and resilient. The Templars' connection to the ancient wisdom of Solomon, though subtle, cannot be overstated. It was not merely symbolic. It shaped their identity, their purpose, and their methods. Every vow they took, Every battle they fought, and every secret they guarded was a continuation of a mission begun centuries before, when the first scribes fled the destruction of the temple. In this light, the Templars were not just knights. They were the living bridge between eras, custodians of a heritage that demanded courage, patience, and unwavering faith. And yet, even in their ascendancy, there were shadows. Rumors of hidden knowledge, of secret rituals, and of extraordinary power drew envy, fear, and suspicion. The seeds of future conflict were already being sown, for the world is seldom comfortable with those who guard truths beyond comprehension. The Order's outward success and inner secrecy created a tension that would define its history, a tension that would eventually lead to trials, accusations, and events so dramatic that they would be etched into the collective memory of Europe for centuries to come. In retrospect, the birth of the Templars can be seen not only as a response to practical need, the protection of pilgrims, but as the inevitable emergence of a disciplined conduit for wisdom too precious to lose. They were shaped by history, yes, but they also shaped it, carrying forward a legacy of knowledge, devotion, and secrecy that would influence generations in ways still being discovered. Theirs was a path of courage intertwined with contemplation, a balance of action and mystery that set them apart from any other group of their time and connected them, in ways subtle but profound, to the long shadow of Solomon's temple and the order that had once protected its secrets. Beneath the shining armor and rigid discipline of the Templars, a hidden current flowed, one that few outsiders would ever glimpse. The world knew them as knights, as defenders of pilgrims, as fierce warriors who struck fear into the hearts of those who threatened the Holy Land. Yet within the order existed a secret that transcended sword and shield, a spiritual and intellectual inheritance that connected them, however subtly, to the ancient order of Solomon. It was a knowledge that spoke not of conquest but of understanding, a wisdom preserved through centuries of secrecy, carefully hidden beneath layers of ritual and allegory, accessible only to those deemed worthy. The initiation rites of the order were designed not merely to test physical courage, but to awaken perception, intellect, and moral fortitude. A young knight, before taking his final vows, was required to confront challenges that were both external and internal. In shadowed chambers illuminated by the flickering light of candles, he would face symbolic trials, puzzles and enigmas, questions of loyalty and faith, and tasks that demanded patience, discernment, and moral clarity. Each step of the process was intended to teach that true strength was not measured by the sword alone, but by the ability to navigate the unseen, the subtle, and the sacred. Those who failed were quietly removed from the inner circle, their ignorance a safeguard for the knowledge they could not yet comprehend. The texts studied by the Templars were equally enigmatic. Manuscripts preserved in hidden libraries contained symbols, diagrams, and coded writings that resisted casual interpretation. Many of these were believed to originate from the custodians of Solomon's wisdom, carefully transmitted through generations. To the uninitiated, they appeared to be theological musings, allegorical stories, or philosophical speculation. But to those trained in the order's methods, each line contained layered meaning, instructions, warnings, and insights into the forces that governed both the material and spiritual worlds. The Templars were not merely guardians of territory. They were guardians of truth, tasked with preserving knowledge whose misuse could unleash consequences far beyond the battlefield. The duality of their mission became increasingly apparent as the order grew. On one side were the tangible responsibilities, protecting pilgrims, defending territories, and serving as a disciplined military force. On the other were the intangible duties, the protection of knowledge, the cultivation of insight, and the careful navigation of secrecy. This duality shaped every aspect of Templar life. Even the design of their fortresses reflected both practical and symbolic purposes. Towers, halls, and chapels were built with a meticulous attention to geometry, alignment, and hidden meaning, suggesting that architecture itself could be a vessel for knowledge. Within these walls, knights moved in patterns that were both functional and ritualistic, ensuring that sacred wisdom was preserved even in the midst of worldly obligations. It was perhaps inevitable that such a concentration of skill, wealth, and secrecy would attract attention. Monarchs, clergy, and scholars all observed the Templars with a mixture of awe, envy, and suspicion. Rumors abounded about their hidden knowledge, their mysterious rituals, and the treasures they were said to guard. Some stories suggested that the knights possessed relics of extraordinary power, remnants of Solomon's temple, or even the Ark of the Covenant itself. Others hinted at secret codes embedded in their architecture and manuscripts, conveying truths that could alter understanding of faith, law, and the natural order. While many of these tales were exaggerated, the persistent whispers only reinforced the aura of mystique surrounding the order. The Templars' adherence to secrecy was absolute. Members were forbidden to reveal the hidden knowledge to outsiders, and even within the order, information was shared selectively, according to rank and aptitude. This culture of secrecy was not mere paranoia. It was a necessary precaution, designed to protect both the knowledge and those entrusted with it. Throughout history, human curiosity has often proven dangerous, and the Templars understood that wisdom, if misused or revealed prematurely, could be catastrophic. Their rules of discretion were strict, and violation could result in expulsion or worse. The order's survival depended not only on martial skill, but on unwavering fidelity to the preservation of secrets that had been guarded for generations. Yet, for all their discipline and secrecy, the Templars were not immune to the human desire for understanding, for discovery, for enlightenment. Within the order, there was a relentless pursuit of insight, an insatiable curiosity that drove knights to study, to meditate, and to explore the deeper dimensions of existence. They sought not merely to accumulate knowledge, but to comprehend it, to understand the patterns that linked the physical and spiritual worlds, and to apply that understanding in ways that could protect the innocent, guide rulers, and influence events without drawing attention. In this sense, the Templars were philosophers as much as warriors, scholars as much as soldiers. The rituals, symbols, and teachings of the order were carefully layered, designed to encode profound truths in ways that were invisible to the casual observer. Allegorical stories served as guides to moral and spiritual development, while geometric patterns and architectural alignments conveyed knowledge of cosmic order. Some manuscripts contained complex numerical systems, celestial charts, and philosophical frameworks that demanded both intelligence and intuition to decipher. The knights who mastered these systems became custodians not only of texts but of wisdom that could illuminate human behavior, reveal moral principles, and suggest pathways to harmony between earthly action and divine intent. Despite the depth of their understanding, the Templars remained bound to the practical realities of their time. They were engaged in the defense of the Holy Land, in negotiations with kings and popes, and in the administration of a vast and growing network of fortresses and estates. Their spiritual mission was inseparable from their worldly duties, and their success required an extraordinary balance of discipline, intelligence, and moral courage. Each victory on the battlefield, each successful defense of a pilgrim, was intertwined with their hidden work of preserving knowledge, ensuring that their outward actions aligned with the greater purpose entrusted to them by a legacy older than their order itself. This hidden purpose also shaped their relationships with others. Loyalty, trust, and discretion were paramount. Knights learned to observe subtle cues, to read gestures and words, and to understand the intentions of those around them. Every alliance, every decision, carried the weight of both worldly consequence and the safeguarding of hidden wisdom. Their vigilance was relentless, and yet, paradoxically, it allowed them to operate quietly, influencing events without attracting overt attention. In the delicate balance between secrecy and action, the Templars became an order capable of extraordinary impact, both seen and unseen. As the order matured, their influence extended beyond the immediate theaters of the Crusades. Their teachings, their symbols, and their methods subtly infiltrated broader aspects of European society. Architecture, legal practices, and even the emerging intellectual movements of the time bore traces of Templar influence, hints of a continuity of wisdom that stretched back to the ancient custodians of Solomon's knowledge. The order's hidden legacy was thus both temporal and timeless. It shaped immediate events while preserving insights that could survive centuries of upheaval and destruction. It is this duality of visible action and hidden purpose that defines the Templars' enduring mystique. To the outside world, they were warriors and administrators. To those initiated in the deepest layers of their order, they were custodians of secrets older than kingdoms, guardians of wisdom that had survived millennia. Their path was fraught with danger, temptation, and the constant tension between revelation and concealment. And yet, they persisted, understanding that the survival of knowledge required patience, courage, and unwavering fidelity to a mission far greater than any single human lifetime. In contemplating the inner life of the Templars, one cannot help but recognize the extraordinary human effort required to maintain such an order. The fusion of martial skill, spiritual discipline, and intellectual pursuit demanded a level of commitment and resilience that few could sustain. Yet for those who succeeded, the rewards were profound. Insight, understanding, and a connection to a legacy that traced back to the ancient wisdom of Solomon, the king whose knowledge had inspired their mission. The hidden lineage of the Templars, woven into the very fabric of their existence, raises questions that continue to captivate historians, scholars, and seekers of mysteries alike. What knowledge did they truly possess? How did they interpret and apply the inheritance of Solomon's order? And perhaps most compelling of all, what remains hidden today, preserved in symbols, texts, and traditions that have survived centuries, waiting for those capable of perceiving them? The answers may forever elude the uninitiated, yet the allure of discovery, the thrill of connection to something greater than oneself, ensures that the story of the Templars remains alive, vivid, and profoundly human. Symbols were the silent language of the Templars, a code embedded in plain sight yet understood only by those who had been initiated into the deeper mysteries of the order. From the red cross stitched upon their cloaks to the intricate designs of their fortresses, every emblem, every geometric alignment, carried meaning far beyond mere decoration. These symbols were the fingerprints of a secret lineage, a subtle inheritance from the ancient custodians of Solomon's wisdom, designed to communicate truth without ever revealing it fully to the uninitiated. To the casual observer, a cross, a triangle, or a twin pillar might appear ornamental, but to those trained to perceive, it was a roadmap of understanding, a guide to the hidden forces that shaped the spiritual and material world. The twin towers, recurring in Templar architecture, were more than structural elements. They were deliberate symbols of duality. They represented balance, vigilance, and the convergence of earthly and divine principles. Legends suggest that they mirrored the twin pillars of Solomon's temple, which were said to stand at the entrance to the sacred inner sanctum. Those pillars were not merely stone. They were metaphors, conveying truths about the nature of wisdom, judgment, and the relationship between man and the divine. The Templars, whether consciously or intuitively, carried these lessons forward, embedding them in every fortress, chapel, and manuscript they created, preserving a continuity of knowledge that bridged centuries. Even the Red Cross, now so iconic, was more than a mark of Christian devotion. To the initiated, it symbolized sacrifice, discernment, and the alignment of action with divine will. It was a visible commitment to a path of discipline and secrecy, a constant reminder that the knights were not merely protectors of pilgrims or lands, but custodians of wisdom that could not be entrusted to the unprepared. The cross was a signal to those in the know and a warning to those who might seek the knowledge for personal gain. These knights carried responsibilities that transcended earthly ambition. The Templar symbolism extended beyond clothing and architecture into ritual and manuscript. Their texts were often layered with multiple meanings, designed to reveal insights only to those who had been trained in the subtle codes of the order. Allegories, metaphors, and numerological patterns hid instructions for understanding the cosmos, human nature, and the sacred laws that governed existence. A story that appeared on the surface to be a parable of morality could, with the right knowledge, reveal guidance for spiritual practice, meditation, or even the organization of society. In this way, the symbols served as both a shield and a beacon, protecting knowledge from misuse while guiding the faithful toward greater understanding. The careful integration of symbols into architecture was equally remarkable. Templar churches, fortresses, and preceptories were not merely functional structures. They were instruments of instruction. The placement of pillars, the orientation of doorways, the proportion of spaces, and even the decoration of walls were designed to reflect principles of balance, harmony, and divine order. Some scholars have suggested that these buildings encoded celestial knowledge, aligning with the movements of the stars and planets in ways that connected human activity with the rhythms of the cosmos. The knights who lived and trained within these walls were subtly attuned to these patterns, internalizing lessons that shaped their perception, decision-making, and spiritual development. Symbols also served as a form of communication across time and space. In a world without printing presses, email, or modern means of transmission, knowledge had to be safeguarded physically and intellectually. Emblems, coded manuscripts, and architectural cues allowed the order to convey wisdom across generations without the risk of interception or misinterpretation. A knight could travel to a distant preceptory and recognize in its design or inscriptions the continuity of the order's purpose, connecting him to a lineage that stretched back centuries to the custodians of Solomon's temple. In this way, symbols became a language of immortality, preserving the essence of knowledge even as individuals came and went. Perhaps most intriguingly, the Templars' symbols carried multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. To outsiders, they were protective, aesthetic, or religious motifs. To the initiated, they were maps, instructions, and reminders of moral and spiritual principles. And to the most advanced adepts, they were keys, guiding the seeker to insights that transcended the physical world, revealing truths about the universe, the self, and the hidden forces connecting all things. The ability to navigate these layers required discipline, study, and intuition, ensuring that only those fully prepared could access the deepest truths. The secrecy of symbolic knowledge was not merely theoretical. It was enforced rigorously. Knights were trained to recognize the difference between those ready to receive guidance and those who might be corrupted or overwhelmed by it. Misinterpretation could be dangerous. In a time of political intrigue, religious conflict, and war, knowledge was power, and power in the wrong hands could be catastrophic. The Templars understood this implicitly, which is why symbols were designed to be ambiguous to the untrained eye while transmitting profound meaning to the initiated. Their mastery of coded communication made the order resilient, adaptable, and virtually impervious to casual scrutiny. The significance of symbolism extended beyond instruction. It was deeply emotional and psychological. The presence of sacred signs, geometric patterns, and allegorical motifs reinforced a sense of purpose, belonging, and identity. A knight standing beneath the twin towers or meditating upon a carved symbol was not merely observing art or architecture. He was participating in a lineage of knowledge, connecting with ancestors who had preserved the secrets of Solomon's temple, and internalizing principles that would guide him in thought, action, and morality. Symbols became a living thread, weaving together past, present, and future, ensuring that the order's ethos remained intact even as the knights faced the unpredictability of life and war. The power of these symbols lay in their subtlety. Unlike overt displays of wealth, might, or authority, symbols operated quietly, shaping understanding without attracting attention. They offered guidance to those trained to perceive it, while concealing knowledge from those who might misuse it. In this sense, the Templars' symbolic system was not merely decorative or ritualistic, it was strategic. It allowed the order to extend its influence without exposing its secrets, to preserve wisdom across generations, and to cultivate a sense of unity, purpose, and ethical responsibility among its members. Even today, centuries later, the echoes of Templar symbolism remain, hidden in architecture, manuscripts, and legends. Scholars and seekers who study these traces often find themselves captivated by the layering of meaning, the precision of design, and the depth of philosophical and spiritual insight encoded in what might otherwise seem ornamental. These symbols are not merely historical curiosities. They are gateways to understanding a mindset, a purpose, and a continuity of knowledge that transcends the ordinary boundaries of time and space. They remind us that some truths, carefully hidden, can survive generations, influencing thought, belief, and action long after the original custodians have vanished. In reflecting upon the Templars' symbolic legacy, one begins to understand the extraordinary foresight, discipline, and subtlety required to preserve knowledge in a world often hostile to understanding. Symbols were more than signs. They were living instruments of guidance, instruction, and protection. They were a bridge connecting ancient wisdom to the knights of the medieval world, linking the mysteries of Solomon's temple to the practical and spiritual endeavors of a secretive and extraordinary order. Through them, the Templars ensured that their hidden inheritance could endure, quietly shaping the minds and hearts of those prepared to receive it, while remaining invisible to the uninitiated and the unworthy alike. Among the many legends surrounding the Templars, none has captivated the imagination as powerfully as the stories of the treasure they guarded. Unlike ordinary spoils of war or accumulated wealth, this treasure was not simply material. It was a fusion of the sacred and the extraordinary, items imbued with meaning that transcended mere possession. Gold and silver may have glittered in their coffers, but what truly drew attention, both envy and reverence, were the relics, texts, and artifacts said to carry remnants of Solomon's temple itself. Each piece was a link to a lost world, a tangible connection to a lineage of wisdom that had survived centuries of destruction, exile, and secrecy. The most famous of these rumored treasures was the Ark of the Covenant. Stories passed down through whispers and obscure manuscripts suggested that the Ark was not merely a container of stone tablets. It was a vessel of power, a repository of divine instruction, and a symbol of the covenant between humanity and the divine. Those who possessed it, or even glimpsed its influence, were thought to gain insight into the hidden laws of the universe, a profound understanding that could shape the course of kingdoms. For the Templars, the Ark was both a sacred responsibility and an overwhelming burden, a treasure that demanded vigilance, reverence, and secrecy. Yet the Ark was only part of the story. The Templars were also said to have gathered sacred manuscripts, encoded texts, and artifacts with mystical properties. Some contained knowledge of ancient rituals, alchemical processes, or philosophical principles passed down from the Order of Solomon. Others were thought to hold insights into celestial movements, moral law, and the architecture of the cosmos itself. Each item was carefully catalogued, preserved, and hidden in fortified chambers, protected by layers of secrecy designed to deter even the most determined intruders. The presence of these items elevated the Templars from mere warriors to custodians of wisdom whose significance could scarcely be overstated. The allure of such a treasure inevitably drew attention. Kings, nobles, and religious leaders all sought to uncover the secrets of the Templars, driven by ambition, fear, or curiosity. Rumors of unimaginable wealth, divine artifacts, and coded manuscripts created a sense of both awe and danger. The knights themselves remained cautious, aware that the true power of the treasure lay not in its visibility but in its concealment. They understood that knowledge, once revealed to the unworthy, could be destructive, destabilizing not only their order but entire realms. In this, the treasure was as much a moral responsibility as it was a material one, a test of character for those entrusted to guard it. Stories of the Templars' treasure often blurred the line between history and legend, fact and imagination. Chroniclers and later historians speculated endlessly about what they might have possessed. Some accounts described vast hoards of gold, silver, and precious jewels accumulated through donations and conquests, stored in secret vaults beneath fortified commanderies. Others focused on the spiritual and mystical treasures, the manuscripts, scrolls, and artifacts linked to the lost wisdom of Solomon's temple. These stories, while often fragmentary or contradictory, served to enhance the mystique of the order, reinforcing the idea that the Templars were not ordinary knights, but guardians of something far greater than temporal power. The management of this treasure required extraordinary discipline and trust. The order's hierarchical structure ensured that only those with sufficient rank and training had access to the most sacred items. Novices might witness only the outer layers of ritual, while senior knights could study and protect texts, artifacts, and symbols of profound importance. Each item was meticulously recorded, hidden, and guarded, sometimes in underground chambers designed to resist fire, flood, and theft. The architecture itself became part of the security system, with secret passages, hidden alcoves, and cryptic inscriptions guiding the faithful and deterring the uninitiated. Even the most casual visitor to a Templar preceptory would sense the careful deliberation with which every element was placed, hinting at the immense significance of what lay beyond sight. Yet perhaps the most compelling aspect of the treasure was its moral and spiritual dimension. The Templars did not seek the relics for personal gain. Wealth was a tool, a means to fund their operations and defend pilgrims. But the true treasure was wisdom, connection, and understanding. Possessing the Ark, sacred manuscripts, or relics of Solomon's temple was not an opportunity to dominate, but a responsibility to preserve and protect. The knights were acutely aware that they were part of a lineage, a living chain of guardians stretching back to a time long before the Crusades, entrusted with secrets whose misuse could have catastrophic consequences. This awareness imbued every action, every decision, and every journey with a profound sense of purpose and solemnity. The treasure also played a role in shaping the internal culture of the Templars. Knowledge of its existence reinforced the importance of loyalty, discipline, and secrecy. It created an unspoken understanding that every knight's life was intertwined with the survival of the Order's mission. Rivalries were secondary to duty. Ambition was tempered by devotion. The treasure, both material and spiritual, became a touchstone, reminding the Order that their responsibilities extended beyond the battlefield, beyond temporal power, into the realm of legacy, morality, and eternal truth. Legends surrounding the treasure also suggest that some items had qualities that challenged ordinary comprehension. Certain manuscripts were said to reveal patterns in nature, principles of the cosmos, or secrets of human consciousness that could not be fully grasped without initiation. Some relics were rumored to possess metaphysical properties, amplifying intuition, focus, or spiritual connection. While much of this may be embellished or lost to time, the persistent nature of these stories underscores the profound impression the Templars made on their contemporaries, inspiring awe, fear, and fascination. The pursuit of such treasures inevitably invited danger. Enemies, both political and religious, coveted the artifacts, seeking to claim power, wealth, or knowledge for themselves. The Templars' survival depended on a careful balance of openness and concealment, of visibility and secrecy. While they operated in the public eye as protectors and financiers, the most important aspects of their mission remained hidden from all but the initiated. This duality, operating simultaneously in the world of men and the world of the unseen, defined the Templars' uniqueness and their enduring mystique. The story of the treasure is ultimately a story of stewardship. It is a tale of individuals entrusted with the protection of knowledge, understanding, and sacred objects that could influence generations. It is a story of courage, discipline, and restraint, of men and women who understood that true power lies not in possession but in guardianship. Each scroll, relic, or artifact represented a bridge to the past, a connection to a wisdom that predated kingdoms, empires, and even religions, a reminder that the Templars' mission was timeless and sacred. Even today, centuries after the dissolution of the Order, the allure of the Templars' treasure continues to captivate imaginations. Researchers, historians, and adventurers search for traces of what was lost, guided by fragments of manuscripts, architectural clues, and the faint echoes of legend. The treasure's significance lies not only in what may or may not be recovered but in the story itself, a story of devotion, secrecy, and an unwavering commitment to protect something far greater than individual ambition. The Templars' legacy endures because of their courage, their wisdom, and the treasures they safeguarded, treasures that symbolize a human connection to the sacred and the eternal. Ultimately, the treasure of the Templars was never about wealth or conquest. It was about preserving a lineage of knowledge, safeguarding a hidden inheritance, and maintaining a continuity of wisdom that had survived the collapse of Solomon's temple and centuries of turmoil. It was a treasure of the mind and spirit as much as the body, a collection of truths and symbols that demanded reverence, discretion, and unwavering devotion. And in guarding it, the Templars ensured that a link to ancient knowledge survived, a whisper of understanding that could, if ever fully revealed, change the way humanity perceives itself and its history. The Templars' rise to prominence did not go unnoticed. Across Europe, kings and popes alike watched their increasing wealth, influence, and organizational skill with a mixture of admiration and unease. While the knights were celebrated as defenders of faith and guardians of pilgrims, there was an undercurrent of tension that few dared to acknowledge. The order was exceptional not only for its martial prowess but for its extraordinary autonomy. Commanderies dotted the continent, each operating with remarkable efficiency and often answering only to the Grand Master in Jerusalem. Their independence, combined with the rumors of hidden treasures and secret knowledge, made rulers wary. The order's influence extended far beyond battlefields. It seeped into courts, politics, and the very structures of European power. Monarchs, aware of the Templars' immense resources, sought to secure alliances, donations, and political favors. In France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, nobles were both drawn to the order's prestige and cautious of its growing authority. The knights possessed financial acumen rare for their time, operating banks and managing estates in ways that prefigured modern systems. Pilgrims deposited funds with them, nobles entrusted wealth, and the order became an indispensable part of the medieval economy. Yet, with this integration came scrutiny. Kings coveted their influence, suspicious that a force so disciplined and loyal only to itself could pose a threat if ever turned against secular authority. The very efficiency that made the Templars formidable also sowed seeds of fear among those in power. The papacy, too, observed the order with ambivalent attention. On one hand, the Templars served the Church's mission with unparalleled dedication, providing security in the Holy Land and demonstrating unwavering devotion. On the other, the secrecy and sophistication of the order were alarming. Rumors of hidden rituals, esoteric teachings, and sacred relics linked to ancient wisdom circulated quietly in ecclesiastical circles. Some church officials questioned the appropriateness of an organization operating with such independence, possessing not only martial and financial power but access to knowledge that could rival the authority of Rome itself. The tension between necessity and suspicion would define the order's relationship with the highest echelons of Christendom for decades to come. Political intrigue became a constant reality for the Templars. Kings and princes sought to influence their actions, negotiating alliances and favoring certain leaders within the order. At the same time, the knights carefully navigated these pressures, maintaining loyalty to the papacy while safeguarding their autonomy and, more importantly, the secrets entrusted to them. Their diplomatic skill was as critical to their survival as their prowess on the battlefield. Letters, envoys, and subtle gestures conveyed messages that only those attuned to the order's codes could interpret. Every interaction was fraught with risk, yet meticulously calculated to ensure that the Templars' mission remained uncompromised. The Templars' reputation for secrecy only fueled speculation. Across Europe, whispers suggested that the knights possessed relics of extraordinary power, fragments of Solomon's Temple, the Ark of the Covenant, and manuscripts containing forbidden wisdom. Some claimed the order had knowledge of mystical sciences, sacred geometries, and even hidden maps pointing to treasures and secrets lost to the ages. While contemporary scholars debate the veracity of these claims, the persistence of such stories highlights the order's psychological and symbolic influence. Even without direct evidence, the perception of secret knowledge amplified both respect and fear, shaping political and social interactions across kingdoms. Among rulers, envy was often intertwined with necessity. The Templars' financial network made them indispensable, yet it also made them formidable. Monarchs relied on their funds to wage wars, build fortifications, and sustain armies, while simultaneously fearing that the order's autonomy could be turned against them. This tension created a precarious balance. Kings sought to gain the Templars' favor without provoking suspicion, while the knights carefully maintained their independence. The line between alliance and antagonism was razor-thin, and navigating it required both subtlety and foresight. The influence of the Templars extended beyond the courts and battlefields. In towns, villages, and cities where their preceptories were located, the knights were respected for their discipline, charity, and protection of pilgrims. Merchants, artisans, and ordinary people benefited from the security and stability the order provided, and in turn, their presence reinforced the knights' authority. Yet even in these communities, subtle signs of esoteric practice, rituals, symbols, and architectural designs hinted at the deeper purpose of the order. Ordinary observers might see only a disciplined military presence, But those attuned to hidden meanings could discern echoes of ancient knowledge and spiritual continuity reaching back to Solomon's temple. The tension between public service and hidden influence defined the Templars' existence. Every action had dual significance. What was visible to the world, and what was invisible, a careful orchestration to preserve secrets while maintaining legitimacy. Military victories, financial management, and religious devotion were the outward manifestations of the order's power. Beneath these, however, lay an invisible network of knowledge and symbols, a careful cultivation of understanding that linked knights to an ancient lineage and safeguarded wisdom from misuse. This dual existence required remarkable discipline, foresight, and moral clarity, qualities that set the order apart from any contemporary organization. The complexity of the Templars' interactions with kings and popes cannot be understated. They were simultaneously indispensable and threatening, respected and feared, admired and envied. Their role as both protectors of pilgrims and custodians of hidden knowledge created a delicate dance of loyalty and autonomy. Monarchs could command armies, but they could not fully control the Templars' inner workings. The Pope could sanction their actions, yet the deepest truths remained concealed, governed by oaths and rituals older than any earthly authority. This intricate balance of power ensured the order's survival and amplified its mystique, creating an aura of untouchable influence that would fuel both admiration and suspicion for generations. Even as the knights expanded their influence, the psychological weight of their mission remained profound. Knowledge of the treasures, relics, and secrets they guarded was both empowering and burdensome. Every decision carried moral, spiritual, and political consequences. Every alliance, every financial transaction, and every military campaign had the potential to affect not only the visible world but the hidden truths the order sought to protect. The Templars understood that they were not merely participants in history. They were stewards of its unseen currents, responsible for guiding the flow of knowledge and power in ways that would outlast their own lifetimes. It is in this interplay of visible and invisible influence that the Templars' uniqueness becomes most apparent. They were not simply soldiers, financiers, or religious devotees. They were custodians of a lineage, a secret continuity that connected the fall of Solomon's temple to the unfolding events of medieval Europe. Their wealth, discipline, and strategic acumen were tools, means to an end, but the true measure of their significance lay in the preservation of knowledge, symbols, and sacred trust. In this, the Templars were as extraordinary as the legends that would later surround them, embodying both the brilliance and the danger of hidden wisdom in a world ruled by visible power. Even today, the echoes of this influence remain. Scholars trace the subtle traces of Templar architecture, symbols, and manuscripts, discovering the fingerprints of an order that operated with extraordinary foresight and discretion. The interplay between political necessity, spiritual duty, and secret knowledge ensured that the Templars shaped the medieval world in ways that were rarely visible but deeply enduring. Their legacy reminds us that influence is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes, it is quiet, layered, and encoded in the very fabric of society, awaiting those patient enough to discern it. The Templars' relationship with kings and popes was a delicate, ever-shifting equilibrium, a mixture of alliance, negotiation, and strategic autonomy. Their ability to maintain this balance, while simultaneously safeguarding hidden treasures and esoteric wisdom, speaks to a discipline and foresight unmatched by nearly any contemporary institution. It is in this combination of public service and hidden stewardship that the order's enduring mystique lies, a testament to the extraordinary intersection of faith, knowledge, and human ambition. Even the most disciplined and revered orders are not immune to betrayal, and for the Templars, danger often came from the very world they sought to protect. Among the corridors of power, whispers of envy, fear, and ambition spread like a slow, insidious poison. Some kings resented the order's independence, others feared the secrets they held, and still more coveted the wealth and influence that had grown far beyond the knights' humble beginnings. Within the order itself, tensions sometimes simmered, rivalries, doubts, and ambition lurking beneath the stoic faces of those sworn to obedience. Trust, once thought absolute, became a precious commodity, constantly tested against the pressures of duty, survival, and the relentless curiosity of men who desired power at any cost. It began subtly, with quiet questioning and minor disputes over territory, allegiance, or responsibility. Knights who had devoted their lives to the preservation of sacred knowledge found themselves confronted not only by external enemies, but by the shifting loyalties of those around them. Some faltered under pressure, tempted by promises of wealth or influence. Others were coerced, manipulated, or misled into compromising situations. These were not merely tactical challenges. They were moral tests, forcing the Templars to confront the human frailty within their ranks. Each betrayal, real or suspected, became a shadow over the order, a reminder that the preservation of sacred knowledge required vigilance not only against enemies outside, but also against vulnerabilities within. Externally, the stakes were even more perilous. Monarchs and rulers, while benefiting from the Templars' military and financial prowess, grew increasingly wary of their autonomy. Rumors of secret rituals, hidden treasures, and forbidden knowledge stirred fear. Some believed that the order wielded influence far beyond what was apparent, capable of manipulating events in subtle and sometimes dangerous ways. Envoys whispered tales of mystical symbols, encoded manuscripts, and sacred relics said to hold extraordinary power. Whether or not these stories were entirely true mattered little. Perception alone could inspire both awe and hostility, and it was perception that often dictated the fates of men and organizations in medieval Europe. The first notable betrayals were often subtle, manifesting in legal disputes, contested claims of property, or rivalries over commanderies. Knights who disagreed over the interpretation of orders or the allocation of resources sometimes became adversaries, their dissent threatening to fracture the carefully maintained cohesion of the order. While these internal tensions rarely erupted into outright violence, they created fissures that external forces could exploit. Kings and political factions quickly learned that they could manipulate these tensions, using bribery, coercion, or threats to destabilize the order from within. For the Templars, the lesson was clear. Loyalty was as much a shield against human ambition as it was against the enemy in battle. The order's strict codes of secrecy and initiation were designed in part to mitigate such vulnerabilities. Knowledge was shared selectively, access to sacred relics and texts tightly controlled. Novices were gradually introduced to deeper layers of understanding, their aptitude tested at every stage. Yet, despite these precautions, the danger of betrayal persisted. Human desire, fear, and ambition could erode even the strongest oaths. Every knight, no matter how disciplined, was aware that a single act of treachery could endanger the entire mission, exposing secrets that had been preserved for generations. This constant awareness created an atmosphere of vigilance and caution, where trust was granted sparingly and tested relentlessly. Among external threats, envy was particularly insidious. Monarchs saw the Templars' independence as a challenge to their own authority. The order's wealth, accumulated from donations, pilgrim fees, and strategic management of estates, sparked both admiration and greed. Some rulers sought alliances, hoping to harness the order's resources for personal gain, while simultaneously plotting to curtail their autonomy. The Templars navigated this dangerous terrain with skill, balancing diplomacy, loyalty, and discretion. Yet the seeds of eventual catastrophe were sown in these subtle conflicts. History would show that even the most disciplined and revered order could not withstand the combined weight of external envy and internal tension forever. The tension between duty and desire became even more pronounced when knowledge itself was at stake. Knights entrusted with sacred relics, encoded manuscripts, or secret teachings understood that their role was not simply to act in the present, but to safeguard a legacy stretching back centuries. The consequences of betrayal were not merely temporal, they were spiritual and historical. A single lapse in judgment, a misused document, or a compromised relic could unravel centuries of careful preservation, leaving humanity vulnerable to truths it was not prepared to handle. For the Templars, the stakes were nothing less than the survival of knowledge, and this awareness lent every decision a gravity rarely understood by outsiders. Betrayal, when it occurred, often carried profound consequences. Some knights who succumbed to greed or coercion were quietly removed from the order, their ambitions and mistakes swept aside to protect the greater mission. Others faced harsher repercussions, serving as a warning that loyalty and discretion were non-negotiable. Externally, betrayal could take the form of alliances with enemies, leaks of strategic information, or the illicit acquisition of artifacts and manuscripts. In every case, the Order responded with calculated measures, balancing the need for secrecy with the necessity of survival. These incidents were rarely recorded in official histories, leaving only whispers and speculation to hint at the gravity of what had occurred. Despite these challenges, the Templars remained resilient. Their culture of discipline, secrecy, and layered knowledge provided safeguards against the most devastating consequences of betrayal. Knights were trained not only in combat but in observation, discernment, and subtle communication. The symbols and coded texts that permeated the Order served as both instruction and protection, ensuring that even if one element of the system was compromised, the core mission could survive. In this way, the Order functioned as both a fortress and a living organism, capable of adapting, protecting, and continuing its work across generations. The psychological burden of these betrayals was immense. Knights understood that their mission was not merely to defend pilgrims or fight battles, but to protect knowledge that could shape the destiny of nations and civilizations. Every act of vigilance, every strategic decision, and every careful communication carried the weight of history. The tension between loyalty and human weakness, between secrecy and transparency, defined the inner life of the Order. It is perhaps this ever-present awareness of danger, both external and internal, that gave the Templars their extraordinary combination of discipline, foresight, and moral resilience. In reflecting upon the first betrayals, one can see the fragile balance that defined the Order's existence. They were extraordinarily powerful, disciplined, and influential, yet every advantage carried the risk of undoing. The Templars' mastery lay not only in their ability to wield weapons or manage resources, but in their capacity to navigate a world of envy, ambition, and suspicion while preserving secrets that stretched back to the ancient custodians of Solomon's wisdom. Their survival depended on vigilance, foresight, and an unshakable commitment to their sacred mission. A commitment that would be tested again and again as the centuries unfolded. These early betrayals, subtle yet profound, foreshadowed the more dramatic trials that awaited the Order in the centuries to come. They were a reminder that even the most disciplined and devout could falter, and that the preservation of sacred knowledge was a task that demanded constant awareness, strategic thinking, and unwavering moral clarity. Every whisper of treachery, every hint of disloyalty, reinforced the importance of secrecy, discipline, and fidelity to the mission. The Templars learned early that the greatest threats were not always external. Sometimes, they came from within, hidden behind the faces of those sworn to protect the very secrets that gave the Order its extraordinary significance. In the end, the first betrayals were both a challenge and a lesson. They revealed the vulnerabilities inherent in human nature, the dangers of ambition and desire, and the extraordinary discipline required to safeguard knowledge that could shape the course of history. They strengthened the Order in ways that would not be immediately visible, forging a culture of vigilance, loyalty, and resilience that would define the Templars for generations. And in this interplay of trust, betrayal, and the stewardship of secrets, the Order began to understand the full weight of their mission. A mission that would continue to echo through history, leaving a legacy of mystery, power, and extraordinary human dedication. Beyond the battlefield, beyond the rigid discipline and secrecy, the Templars lived in a world that balanced devotion and curiosity, mysticism and practicality. Their public persona was one of martial skill, religious dedication, and strategic intelligence. Yet beneath this visible exterior flowed a hidden current of contemplation, study, and spiritual inquiry. The Knights moved through their days as protectors of pilgrims, administrators of estates, and financiers of burgeoning medieval economies, all while carrying the weight of a sacred inheritance that reached back to the enigmatic Order of Solomon. Their lives were a duality. They were warriors of flesh and blood, and simultaneously, seekers of hidden truth, custodians of knowledge that could reshape understanding if ever fully revealed. The Templars' mystical dimension was not incidental. It was essential. Training in combat, strategy, and discipline prepared them to face tangible dangers, but study of symbols, texts, and rituals prepared them for the intangible challenges, the ethical dilemmas, spiritual temptations, and profound moral questions inherent in wielding both power and secret knowledge. Within the quiet walls of their commanderies, knights would meditate upon manuscripts containing allegorical stories, encoded diagrams, and esoteric instructions that had been preserved and transmitted for centuries. These texts were not simple religious works. They were layered with multiple meanings, designed to be interpreted in sequence as the knight's understanding deepened, guiding him toward insights that blended spirituality, philosophy, and practical wisdom. This duality was most apparent in the contrast between the life of battle and the life of study. On the battlefield, the Templars were disciplined, coordinated, and ruthless when necessary, displaying a unity and precision that became the stuff of legend. Yet off the field, in cloisters and libraries, the same knights engaged in patient contemplation, study, and ritual practice, learning to discern patterns in the cosmos, in human behavior, and in the hidden structures of sacred law. They were trained to recognize that true mastery required both action and reflection, that strength without understanding could be destructive, and that knowledge without discipline was meaningless. In essence, the Templars were scholars and mystics in armor, their lives a fusion of visible power and invisible insight. The secret knowledge they pursued was as practical as it was mystical. Manuals of strategy and governance, texts on celestial navigation and architecture, and even early proto-alchemical works were all considered part of the inheritance they safeguarded. These were tools not for personal ambition but for the stewardship of a fragile, complex order that relied on both visible prowess and hidden wisdom to survive. The knights' education was rigorous. They memorized texts, deciphered codes, and practiced rituals that connected their understanding of the sacred with the tangible realities of the world around them. This combination of mental, spiritual, and physical training was what allowed the order to operate with remarkable efficiency, influence, and resilience, even in the face of enemies both human and unseen. One of the most striking aspects of the Templars' mysticism was their attention to symbolism. The architecture of their commanderies, the layout of their chapels, and the design of their fortresses were not arbitrary. Every line, every angle, and every decoration carried meaning. Some structures aligned with celestial bodies, echoing patterns said to have been preserved from the Temple of Solomon. Others encoded moral or philosophical principles, ensuring that knights moving through these spaces absorbed lessons simply by inhabiting them. To outsiders, these features appeared as art or engineering, but to the initiated, they were living instructions, tools for meditation and understanding. In this way, the Templars' environment became an extension of their intellectual and spiritual practice, a physical manifestation of the hidden wisdom they sought to preserve. Their rituals, too, were carefully layered. Initiations, ceremonies, and daily practices were designed to reveal deeper truths gradually, ensuring that knowledge was not revealed before the knight was prepared to comprehend it fully. A single misstep in interpretation could be dangerous, either morally or practically, and the order's training sought to cultivate patience, discernment, and ethical integrity. Each knight learned to navigate both the visible and invisible worlds, recognizing that mastery required not just intelligence or courage, but moral clarity and spiritual sensitivity. This cultivation of character was inseparable from the order's mission, for they understood that knowledge alone could be destructive if wielded without discipline. The Templars' mystical pursuits were not purely theoretical. They had tangible consequences in daily life. Knights were trained to read patterns in human behavior, to anticipate threats, and to interpret signs that others might miss. They were taught that observation, analysis, and intuition were as critical in diplomacy and strategy as in combat. The combination of mystical study and practical application allowed the order to wield influence subtly, guiding events without revealing their full capabilities. In this way, the Templars were both actors and observers, shaping outcomes while preserving the secrecy of the knowledge that empowered them. Travel was another dimension of their mystical education. Pilgrimages, reconnaissance missions, and journeys between commanderies were opportunities to study landscapes, cultures, and patterns of human behavior. Knights observed markets, court proceedings, religious rituals, and even architectural features, integrating these observations into a broader understanding of the world. Their movement through Europe and the Holy Land was not merely tactical but educational, connecting them to the larger currents of history, culture, and spiritual tradition. Each journey reinforced the dual purpose of their existence: to act in the world while maintaining a constant engagement with knowledge that transcended the immediate moment. The psychological and emotional demands of this dual existence were immense. The knights were constantly aware that their lives were not their own, that their choices had consequences for the preservation of wisdom and the protection of innocence. Every battle, every administrative decision, and every interaction carried layers of significance. Failure or betrayal was not only personal but existential, threatening the integrity of an order that had survived centuries of destruction and exile. Yet within this pressure lay purpose, a profound sense of mission that imbued even the most mundane tasks with extraordinary significance. Despite their extraordinary discipline, the Templars were not immune to human doubt or curiosity. Questions about the nature of their mission, the depth of their inherited knowledge, and the ultimate meaning of their sacred duties were inevitable. These questions were not suppressed but integrated into their education, treated as pathways to greater understanding rather than distractions. Reflection and discussion, guided by experienced masters within the order, allowed knights to confront their uncertainties, deepen their comprehension, and internalize the ethical and spiritual principles that underpinned their work. In this way, curiosity became a tool rather than a liability, enhancing the order's resilience and insight. The Templars' dual life, warriors in the visible world, seekers in the invisible, ultimately defined their uniqueness and enduring mystique. Their discipline, secrecy, and intellectual rigor allowed them to navigate a complex medieval world while safeguarding knowledge that stretched back to the custodians of Solomon's temple. Their influence, often invisible, extended beyond the battlefield, shaping politics, religion, and culture in ways that were subtle yet profound. By balancing action with reflection, power with wisdom, and secrecy with discipline, the knights became both guardians of the sacred and architects of strategy, a combination rarely matched in human history. In contemplating the Templars' life beyond combat, one sees a profound lesson. True mastery requires integration. Physical skill alone is insufficient. Knowledge alone is meaningless without ethical discernment and disciplined application. Spiritual insight must be paired with action, and secrecy must be balanced with engagement. The Templars embodied this integration, their daily lives a complex choreography of duty, study, and contemplation. They were not merely warriors or scholars. They were living vessels of continuity, carrying forward the legacy of Solomon's wisdom while actively shaping the world around them. Through this balance, the order achieved something extraordinary: the preservation of knowledge, the cultivation of moral and spiritual insight, and the exercise of influence in ways that were almost invisible. Even as kingdoms waged wars and empires rose and fell, the Templars' dual mission ensured that the wisdom of the past endured, quietly shaping the present and leaving echoes that resonate even today. In their lives, one sees the profound interplay between visible action and invisible guidance, between worldly duty and sacred responsibility, a model of resilience, discipline, and foresight that remains awe-inspiring centuries later. Within the hidden chambers of the Templars' preceptories lay another form of power, one less visible but no less potent than the sword: knowledge. Their libraries were not merely collections of texts. They were sanctuaries of thought, repositories of wisdom accumulated over centuries, meticulously curated and fiercely protected. Scrolls and manuscripts arrived from distant lands, carried by travelers, pilgrims, and surviving scribes who had preserved fragments of ancient knowledge through fire, exile, and war. These texts were layered with meaning, often encrypted or allegorical, ensuring that only those trained in the order's methods could decode the truths within. To the uninitiated, these volumes might appear as religious or philosophical musings, but to the Templars, they were maps, guides, and instruments of insight, linking the present to a lineage that stretched back to the lost custodians of Solomon's temple. The libraries were more than archives. They were classrooms, laboratories, and meditation chambers all at once. Knights would spend hours, sometimes days, studying a single manuscript, tracing patterns, symbols, or references that others might overlook entirely. Knowledge was not merely read. It was internalized, tested, and applied. A diagram on a faded parchment might reveal architectural principles for a fortress, moral guidance for leadership, or a cosmological truth hidden beneath the veil of allegory. The act of study was inseparable from action. A knight's understanding of these texts shaped his decisions, his strategies, and even his perception of the world. In essence, the libraries were training grounds for wisdom as much as for spiritual or martial discipline. Many of the manuscripts were believed to originate from the remnants of Solomon's temple or the Order of Solomon itself. These texts contained instructions, rituals, and knowledge that had survived centuries of destruction and exile, carefully preserved by those who understood their value. Some were esoteric, detailing moral codes, metaphysical principles, or celestial patterns. Others were practical, offering guidance on architecture, strategy, medicine, or administration. Each text was treated with reverence, a sacred object as potent as any sword or relic. The knowledge they contained was dangerous in untrained hands. A misinterpretation could lead to disaster, not just for the individual but for the order as a whole. The organization of the libraries reflected the Templars' meticulous discipline. Texts were cataloged, cross-referenced, and stored according to principles that combined logic, secrecy, and symbolic meaning. Manuscripts might be hidden behind false walls, stored in rooms accessible only through encoded instructions, or protected by rituals that tested the worthiness of the seeker. Initiates learned to navigate these systems gradually, earning access to deeper layers of wisdom only as their understanding, judgment, and moral clarity advanced. This ensured that knowledge, once entrusted, remained secure, preserved not only from external threats but from the errors of the inexperienced. The content of these hidden texts was astonishing in scope. Beyond the religious and philosophical, there were treatises on early alchemical processes, studies of geometry and proportion, and explorations of celestial phenomena. Some scholars speculate that the Templars possessed insights into mathematics and astronomy far ahead of their time, knowledge that could be applied in navigation, architecture, and even strategy. Others suggest that the texts contained coded guidance for moral and ethical conduct, linking human behavior with universal principles in ways that elevated the understanding of duty, justice, and spiritual responsibility. For the Templars, the libraries were living ecosystems of learning, each manuscript a node in a vast network of wisdom connecting them to the past, the present, and the potential of the future. The libraries also played a critical role in maintaining the continuity of knowledge across generations. Knights who trained in one commandery could recognize symbols, references, and coded instructions in another, ensuring that the order's understanding remained consistent despite geographic dispersion. Manuscripts, rituals, and symbols created a shared language, linking knights across time and space. Even if one location were compromised or destroyed, the knowledge could survive elsewhere, preserved by the unbroken chain of initiates who understood both its meaning and its importance. In this sense, the libraries were both physical and conceptual fortresses, guarding secrets against time, human error, and external threats alike. The process of studying these texts was itself a form of training, demanding concentration, intuition, and ethical reflection. Knights were expected not only to decode symbols or interpret allegories, but also to internalize the lessons in ways that inform their actions. Understanding without application was insufficient. Knowledge had to manifest in behavior, strategy, and decision-making. This dynamic created a culture of constant learning, a recognition that wisdom was not static but lived and applied. It also reinforced the order's moral framework, reminding knights that power, whether derived from weapons or knowledge, carried responsibilities that could not be ignored. Some manuscripts contained references to relics and artifacts, connecting intellectual understanding to tangible objects of significance. A scroll might describe the construction of an object, its symbolic meaning, or its metaphysical properties. Others contained guidance on sacred rituals or meditative practices, designed to align the knight's mind, spirit, and body with principles encoded in the universe. These connections between knowledge, object, and action illustrate the holistic nature of the Templars' pursuit, Wisdom was never purely theoretical, but intertwined with practical application and spiritual cultivation. The libraries also served as a subtle means of influence. The knowledge preserved within their walls allowed the order to act with foresight, anticipate challenges, and guide decisions in both the spiritual and temporal realms. Knights trained in these texts could navigate political negotiations, military campaigns, and religious disputes with insight that appeared almost prescient. The hidden wisdom, when applied judiciously, became a tool of strategic and moral power, shaping outcomes in ways that were invisible to outsiders. In this way, the libraries were not just repositories of the past. They were instruments for shaping the present and safeguarding the future. Even the physical arrangement of the libraries carried symbolic meaning. Scrolls, books, and objects were often stored according to geometric patterns, sequences, or symbolic hierarchies, reflecting cosmic and moral principles. Access to the deepest layers of knowledge required not just rank but understanding, intuition, and spiritual readiness. Initiates were guided progressively, with each stage of access representing both trust and responsibility. In this sense, the libraries were living systems, encoding lessons about morality, perception, and the interconnectedness of knowledge, power, and ethical duty. Ultimately, the Templars' hidden libraries were more than collections of texts. They were sanctuaries of wisdom, training grounds for moral and spiritual cultivation, and instruments of continuity connecting the order to a lineage that stretched back to Solomon's temple. They exemplified the Templars' dual mission: to act in the world with courage and skill, while simultaneously safeguarding knowledge that transcended time, space, and human understanding. Within these libraries, knights learned not only what to know but how to apply it, ensuring that the order remained resilient, ethical, and effective in both seen and unseen realms. Through the meticulous care, secrecy, and reverence applied to these texts, the Templars ensured that knowledge survived centuries of conflict, persecution, and upheaval. They understood that wisdom, once lost, might never be recovered, and that the survival of humanity's most precious insights depended on vigilant guardianship. The libraries were thus both a responsibility and a gift, linking the order to the past, shaping their actions in the present, and leaving a legacy that continues to intrigue and inspire centuries later. Among the many threads that wove together the Templars' enigmatic existence, none was as fascinating or as perilous as their fascination with alchemy. This was not the alchemy of popular imagination, the simple transmutation of base metals into gold, but a discipline that blended philosophy, mysticism, and the pursuit of hidden truths. Within the quiet chambers of preceptories, beneath the same roofs that housed armored knights and sacred texts, Templars experimented with substances, symbols, and processes in search of understanding that bridged the material and spiritual worlds. Their studies were carefully veiled, often encoded in cryptic manuscripts, allegorical diagrams, and ritualized procedures, ensuring that only those prepared to grasp the deeper meaning could approach the truth. Alchemy, for the Templars, was a path to both insight and discipline. It demanded patience, precision, and a rigorous understanding of natural principles, but also moral and spiritual refinement. The process of transformation, whether metaphorical or literal, mirrored the internal cultivation of the knight. Base metals symbolized unrefined aspects of human character, while the quest to purify or elevate these substances reflected the aspiration to refine the self, align with divine principles, and unlock deeper understanding. Every experiment, whether it succeeded or failed, was a lesson in patience, observation, and the interplay of material reality and spiritual truth. The manuscripts preserved by the order contained detailed instructions and symbolic representations of alchemical processes. At first glance, these texts might appear esoteric, even nonsensical to the casual reader. Lines of coded script, intricate diagrams of vessels and geometric patterns, and references to celestial alignments formed a complex tapestry of knowledge. Yet, for those initiated in the order's methods, these texts revealed principles that were both practical and philosophical. They provided guidance on the manipulation of substances, the observation of natural phenomena, and the cultivation of the mind, spirit, and senses. Alchemy, in the Templars' view, was a comprehensive system, uniting physical experimentation with ethical discipline and spiritual insight. Some historians speculate that the Templars' alchemical pursuits were inspired in part by remnants of ancient knowledge preserved from Solomon's Temple and other mystical traditions. Fragments of texts may have survived, passed through generations, and eventually found their way into the Order's hidden libraries. These works contained wisdom on the composition of matter, the influence of celestial forces, and the interconnection between the microcosm and the macrocosm. The Templars were meticulous in their study, testing hypotheses, observing outcomes, and recording insights in a manner that blended practical science with spiritual symbolism. Each experiment was both an exploration of the natural world and an exercise in moral and intellectual refinement. The symbolic dimension of alchemy was central to its practice. Many of the processes described in Templar manuscripts were deliberately allegorical, encoded to convey lessons that transcended physical experimentation. For example, the transformation of lead into gold symbolized more than chemical transmutation. It represented the purification of the self, the elevation of consciousness, and the alignment of human will with divine principles. Similarly, the combination of disparate elements in a vessel mirrored the harmonization of opposites within the soul, the reconciliation of courage with patience, discipline with intuition, action with contemplation. In this way, alchemy became a mirror of the Order's dual mission, the cultivation of both material skill and spiritual insight. The practical applications of Templar alchemy, while obscure, were likely far-reaching. In an era when medicine, metallurgy, and agriculture were intertwined with mystical and philosophical knowledge, the ability to manipulate substances, understand natural cycles, and recognize patterns in celestial and terrestrial phenomena could confer significant advantage. Knights trained in these disciplines might apply principles to fortification design, battlefield strategy, or the production of medicines and materials. Yet the most profound application was internal, the transformation of the self, the development of insight, and the attainment of moral and spiritual clarity. The alchemical laboratory was, in essence, a sanctuary of discipline, reflection, and revelation. Ritual played a critical role in this work. Experiments were rarely undertaken casually. They were often accompanied by ceremonies, prayers, or meditative practices designed to attune the knight to the deeper currents of the universe. These rituals reinforced the ethical and spiritual dimensions of the work, ensuring that knowledge was approached with reverence and humility. The Templars understood that power without responsibility, insight without moral clarity, or discovery without discipline could lead to catastrophe. By integrating ritual, study, and practical experimentation, they created a holistic approach that combined science, ethics, and spirituality in a single, coherent practice. The alchemical pursuit also strengthened the Templars' cohesion as an order. Knowledge was shared selectively, with access determined by aptitude, rank, and readiness. Novices might observe processes and symbols without comprehending their deeper meaning, while senior knights engaged with the full scope of instruction. This careful stratification ensured both security and continuity, allowing the order to preserve knowledge across generations without risking exposure or misuse. Alchemy, therefore, was not only a method of exploration but a tool for governance, training, and the cultivation of loyalty and ethical discipline. Yet the pursuit of alchemy was not without peril. Rivalries, both internal and external, could threaten the secrecy of experiments. Monarchs and rival factions often coveted the knowledge and materials the order possessed. Even within the ranks, human ambition and curiosity could lead to mistakes or betrayals. The Templars' rigorous codes of secrecy, combined with their hierarchical dissemination of knowledge, mitigated these risks, but the awareness of potential danger added intensity to their work. Every experiment, every observation, and every encoded manuscript carried the weight of centuries of tradition, responsibility, and ethical consequence. The integration of alchemical practice into daily life also reinforced the order's philosophical perspective. Knights came to see the physical world as a reflection of moral and spiritual truths. Observing patterns in matter, experimenting with substances, and decoding allegorical texts trained them to recognize similar patterns in human behavior, political alliances, and the flow of events. In this way, alchemy was not a peripheral pursuit. It was central to the Templars' understanding of the universe, shaping their decisions, strategies, and perception of both seen and unseen forces. The laboratory became a bridge between knowledge and action, contemplation and practice, the hidden and the visible. The legacy of the Templars' alchemical pursuits is still felt in subtle ways. Many manuscripts and diagrams survived, influencing later mystical and scientific traditions. The symbolic logic embedded in these texts resonates in the study of medieval alchemy, occult practice, and esoteric philosophy. More importantly, the approach exemplified by the Templars, the fusion of disciplined observation, ethical reflection, and symbolic understanding, remains a model for integrating intellectual, spiritual, and practical development. Their work illustrates the power of knowledge when pursued with patience, reverence, and moral clarity. In the end, the Templars' engagement with alchemy was far more than a quest for material transformation. It was an exploration of the self, the universe, and the hidden connections that bind them. It demanded discipline, insight, and ethical fortitude. It required that knowledge be approached with humility, guarded with vigilance, and applied with wisdom. And it reinforced the central theme of the order, that true power resides not merely in strength, wealth, or skill, but in the careful, deliberate stewardship of knowledge, insight, and the invisible threads that shape history itself. The Templars' influence, while subtle, inevitably drew the attention of the most powerful and ambitious figures in medieval Europe. Among them, King Philip IV of France emerged as the most formidable threat the order would face in its prime. Known to history as Philip the Fair, he was a man driven by ambition, cunning, and an insatiable desire for both power and wealth. His reign was marked by relentless consolidation of authority, shrewd political maneuvering, and a readiness to confront anyone, even the Church, who might challenge his control. The Templars, with their vast resources, international network, and mysterious aura, quickly became a source of both fascination and alarm. To Philip, they were not merely knights. They were a problem that demanded careful, decisive, and ruthless attention. The king's envy was fueled not only by the order's wealth but by the perception of its autonomy. The Templars operated across Europe and the Holy Land, managing estates, lending funds, and commanding fortresses, all under the leadership of a Grand Master who answered primarily to the Pope. This independence was extraordinary in a period when rulers sought to control every source of power within their realm. Philip saw the order as an obstacle to his ambitions, a parallel authority that could undermine his influence and resist taxation or regulation. The knights' combination of martial, financial, and mystical prowess only heightened his suspicion, creating a potent mixture of fear, greed, and determination that would ultimately lead to a historic confrontation. The Templars' reputation for secrecy added to the king's anxiety. Rumors of hidden knowledge, sacred relics, and arcane practices circulated quietly through the courts and towns of Europe. Some whispered that the knights possessed remnants of Solomon's temple, manuscripts encoded with ancient wisdom, or even relics capable of conferring extraordinary power. Whether true or exaggerated, these stories amplified Philip's sense of threat. To him, the order's unseen influence was as dangerous as any army, for it combined spiritual authority, financial leverage, and the allure of secret knowledge in a way that few could challenge directly. Philip's ambition led him to devise a plan that combined deception, manipulation, and brute force. He cultivated allies within the Church, exploited internal divisions within the order, and positioned himself to strike with maximum impact. The strategy was both political and psychological. By presenting the Templars as heretics, blasphemers, and enemies of the faith, he aimed to justify their arrest and seizure of their assets. This was not a matter of mere conquest. It was an orchestrated effort to eliminate a source of potential resistance and to appropriate wealth and influence that had long been beyond his control. The stakes were enormous, both materially and symbolically, for the Templars represented not only an order of knights but a living connection to ancient, sacred wisdom. The king's agents were meticulous. Spies, informants, and disgruntled insiders were used to gather information on the order's practices, rituals, and holdings. Reports were compiled, accusations fabricated, and testimonies coerced, creating a narrative of corruption, heresy, and moral failure that could be presented to the church and the public. Philip understood the power of perception. By framing the Templars as dangerous and blasphemous, he could achieve multiple goals simultaneously: undermine their reputation, justify legal action, and seize their considerable wealth. The campaign was a masterclass in political strategy, exploiting fear, rumor, and the human propensity for suspicion to devastating effect. Internally, the order faced immense pressure. Knights who had devoted their lives to secrecy, loyalty, and the preservation of knowledge now found themselves under scrutiny from those who had once been allies or neutral observers. Allegations of heresy, blasphemy, and secretive misconduct were leveled publicly, while private interrogations and investigations sowed doubt and fear. The psychological impact on the knights was profound. Even those of the highest rank, trained in discipline, secrecy, and moral fortitude, could not remain entirely immune to the weight of accusation and the threat of betrayal. The balance between maintaining loyalty, protecting sacred knowledge, and navigating political intrigue became increasingly fragile. The Templars' steadfast adherence to secrecy, which had long been their strength, now became a liability. Rituals, symbols, and texts that once guided their spiritual and intellectual development were misinterpreted by outsiders as evidence of blasphemy or occult practice. Actions that had been carefully measured, morally justified, and ethically disciplined were reframed as sinister or conspiratorial. The order's very commitment to preserving knowledge that might destabilize power in unprepared hands made them appear dangerous, even heretical, to those who feared what they could not comprehend. In this way, the Templars' extraordinary discipline and wisdom became entangled with politics, perception, and human fear, setting the stage for a historic confrontation that would alter the course of history. Philip's approach was both patient and relentless. He did not strike impulsively but cultivated the conditions for a dramatic and decisive action. He waited for an opportune moment, carefully orchestrating the timing, witnesses, and narrative of the impending arrests. The aim was to deliver a blow that would be simultaneously shocking, unassailable, and publicly justified. By combining legal authority with spectacle, he intended to dismantle the order entirely, seizing their assets and undermining any remaining perception of invincibility or divine sanction. The plan demonstrated a keen understanding of both human psychology and institutional vulnerability. The Templars could be undermined not only through force but through the careful manipulation of fear, doubt, and perception. The stakes were far more than material. The Templars represented a continuity of knowledge, a lineage of guardianship that stretched back to Solomon's temple and the hidden order that had preserved its wisdom. By challenging the Knights, Philip was not merely attacking a military or financial institution. He was confronting an order whose mission intersected with the preservation of sacred, ancient knowledge. The psychological weight of this confrontation was immense, for the Templars understood that their failure would not only threaten their lives but the continuity of wisdom and the integrity of a lineage preserved for centuries. As the tension built, the Knights remained outwardly composed, adhering to vows of discipline, secrecy, and obedience. Yet beneath this stoicism was a profound awareness of danger. Betrayal, both internal and external, could have catastrophic consequences. Every alliance, every communication, and every decision became a matter of life, legacy, and the safeguarding of secrets whose loss could reverberate across generations. The order's response was calculated, cautious, and disciplined, reflecting both their military training and their spiritual awareness. Their vigilance, however, could not entirely counter the immense resources, political cunning, and relentless ambition of a monarch determined to claim power, wealth, and authority for himself. The unfolding drama between King Philip IV and the Templars exemplifies the extraordinary pressures faced by an order that combined martial prowess, financial acumen, and secret knowledge. It is a story not only of politics, power, and betrayal, but of human ambition confronting human restraint, of wealth and secrecy clashing with authority and suspicion. In this context, the Templars were both extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily vulnerable, their survival contingent upon discipline, foresight, and the unbreakable bonds of loyalty and secrecy that had defined the order since its inception. Ultimately, Philip's obsession with the Templars demonstrates the fear that extraordinary knowledge and autonomy can inspire in those who are unwilling or unprepared to share power. The king's campaign against the order was as much a struggle for control of perception, narrative, and legitimacy as it was a seizure of wealth or property. By manipulating fear, rumor, and political influence, he sought to eliminate an institution whose authority had grown beyond the comprehension of most rulers, while claiming the moral and spiritual high ground. The Templars, for all their discipline and foresight, now faced their greatest challenge yet, a trial that would test the limits of loyalty, secrecy, and the preservation of wisdom under the relentless pressure of political ambition. Word count, 1,140 if you want. I can continue with section 14, expanding it to 100+ words in the same cinematic, mysterious style, keeping the full documentary narrative seamless. The night that would become one of the darkest in the history of the Templars began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as the shadows lengthened over the streets of Paris. The air was thick with cold, the kind that seeped into bones and whispered of impending dread. Within the city's fortified walls, merchants hurried to close their shops, and the occasional torch flickered against ancient stone, casting more shadows than light. Yet amidst this ordinary evening, an extraordinary event was about to unfold, an event that would shake the order to its very foundation and send ripples across Christendom, threatening not only their lives but the continuity of knowledge they had guarded for centuries. It began with the knock, measured, deliberate, at the doors of Templar commanderies. Men who had devoted their lives to discipline, secrecy, and loyalty now faced an unknown threat, an invisible force that sought to dismantle their order from within. The arrest was swift, coordinated, and merciless. Agents of the crown, under orders from King Philip IV, moved with precision, accompanied by a retinue of soldiers and officials who understood the importance of both speed and spectacle. The knights, despite their training and vigilance, were caught off guard by the scale and timing of the operation. Their first moments of realization were filled with disbelief, a cognitive shock compounded by the knowledge that betrayal often comes from the unlikeliest of places. As the torches illuminated the cobblestone streets, the sound of chains, footsteps, and muffled cries created a symphony of fear and despair. Knights who had spent years defending pilgrims now found themselves surrounded, their authority nullified by sheer numbers and political power. The tension was palpable, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and sorrow. Many of the Templars had dedicated their lives to protecting not only people but the secrets they carried, artifacts, manuscripts, and rituals that linked them to a lineage stretching back to Solomon's temple. The threat was not merely to their physical lives. It was to the very mission that had defined their existence. Rumors of heresy, blasphemy, and occult practices were spread with careful intent, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and moral panic. The charges, often fabricated or exaggerated, framed the knights as dangerous, morally corrupt, and unworthy of trust. What had been a disciplined, revered order suddenly appeared in the public eye as a threat to both spiritual and temporal authority. It was a psychological tactic as much as a legal one. By casting doubt upon the Templars' integrity, Philip sought to justify his actions, rally support, and neutralize the influence of an institution whose autonomy and secrecy challenged his ambitions. Inside the commanderies, the knights faced not only external threats but the profound psychological toll of betrayal and accusation. Those who had trained together, shared rituals, and preserved sacred knowledge now confronted a reality in which their loyalty and commitment were questioned. The weight of centuries of hidden wisdom, artifacts, coded manuscripts, and the ethical responsibility to safeguard them now pressed down in the cold light of political machination. Every decision, every word, and every movement was scrutinized. The knights understood that survival would demand not just courage but moral clarity and the ability to navigate an unprecedented crisis with discipline. The arrests were executed with meticulous coordination. Knights were seized from their residences, sometimes in the dead of night, often in the presence of family, peers, and neighbors. Chains rattled, doors were forced open, and the familiar spaces of preceptories became prisons. The psychological impact was deliberate. It was designed to break morale, to instill fear, and to ensure compliance. Yet the Templars, trained in endurance, discipline, and secrecy, responded with remarkable composure. Even in chains, many maintained a stoic presence, aware that panic or resistance could compromise not only themselves but the treasures and knowledge they had been sworn to protect. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of knights were arrested simultaneously, and the coordination extended to multiple cities across France. Couriers and spies had prepared detailed reports of each commandery, identifying key figures, valuable items, and potential resistance. Every detail had been anticipated by Philip's agents. Entrances, exits, guard rotations, and the schedules of daily rituals had been meticulously studied. The Templars, for all their vigilance, were confronted with a combination of political cunning and sheer force that they could neither predict nor fully counter. The ensuing interrogation was brutal and calculated. Knights were subjected to questioning, often under duress, designed to extract confessions, implicate others, or reveal hidden assets. Torture was employed not merely to punish but to destabilize, to create fear, and to coerce testimony that could be used to dismantle the order legally and morally. The psychological impact of these sessions was profound. Those trained to endure the physical rigors of battle were now forced to confront the moral and spiritual weight of accusation. Allegiances were tested, secrets were threatened, and the very fabric of the order's cohesion was strained to its limits. Yet even in the face of such adversity, the Templars' resilience was remarkable. Many knights refused to betray their comrades or divulge sacred knowledge, enduring unimaginable suffering to protect the legacy of the order. This steadfastness reflected the profound discipline instilled through years of rigorous training, spiritual cultivation, and moral education. It was a testament to the extraordinary culture of loyalty and ethical rigor that defined the Templars, a culture that allowed them to withstand pressures that would have broken ordinary men. The arrests and interrogations also had wider implications. Across Europe, news of the Templars' sudden downfall spread quickly, inspiring fear, speculation, and intrigue. Pilgrims, nobility, and clergy alike struggled to reconcile the image of the disciplined, devout knights with the accusations of heresy and corruption. The public spectacle was designed to delegitimize the order, eroding centuries of trust and authority. Yet beneath the surface, observers could sense the extraordinary stakes involved. The hidden treasures, secret knowledge, and ethical responsibilities that had made the Templars both revered and feared. The night of arrest, remembered for its violence and psychological weight, marked a turning point in the history of the order. What had begun as a group devoted to protection, knowledge, and discipline was now thrust into a crisis that challenged every aspect of its identity. Wealth, autonomy, and secrecy became liabilities. Loyalty, resilience, and moral fortitude became essential for survival. The events of that night would ripple across generations, reshaping the order, its legacy, and the perception of those who had once seemed untouchable. Ultimately, the arrests were more than a legal or political maneuver. They were an existential threat to a centuries-old mission of stewardship, knowledge preservation, and spiritual discipline. Every knight arrested faced the possibility of death, the loss of sacred knowledge, and the betrayal of everything they had devoted themselves to protect. Yet the profound courage and discipline displayed by the Templars in those dark hours ensured that, even under extreme pressure, the essence of their order, the secrecy, the wisdom, and the commitment to duty, remained intact, leaving a legacy that continues to fascinate and inspire centuries later. The corridors of the Templars' commanderies, once filled with the quiet rustle of robes, whispered counsel, and the disciplined rhythm of daily ritual, were now transformed into chambers of torment. The knights who had devoted their lives to loyalty, discipline, and the preservation of sacred knowledge were subjected to interrogations that tested the limits of endurance, both physical and moral. Torture was not random. It was calculated, designed to break the will, extract confessions, and undermine the very foundation of trust that had sustained the order for centuries. For those who understood the stakes, each question, each command, and each applied instrument of pain was a direct threat to the legacy they had been sworn to protect, a challenge to both conscience and courage. The methods employed were brutal and unrelenting. Knights were stretched on racks, their limbs strained to breaking, subjected to prolonged exposure, deprivation, and other forms of coercion meant to weaken resolve. Yet these physical torments were secondary to the psychological warfare that accompanied them. Accusations of heresy, blasphemy, and moral corruption were leveled repeatedly, often against fabricated evidence. Some knights were coerced to name alleged conspirators, implicating their brethren in crimes they had not committed. The interrogators understood the power of fear, guilt, and isolation, exploiting every avenue to destabilize the order's cohesion and loyalty. Despite the extreme suffering, many Templars remained steadfast. Years of discipline, rigorous training, and spiritual cultivation had forged men capable of extraordinary resilience. To betray the order, to reveal the secrets of Solomon's inheritance, or to confess to acts that were not committed, would be to jeopardize centuries of preserved knowledge, the very lineage that connected them to the custodians of the temple. The knight's silence was a form of resistance, a shield protecting not only themselves but the integrity of their mission. Every refusal, every display of unwavering discipline under duress, reinforced the extraordinary ethical and moral framework that had guided the order since its inception. The psychological impact of these trials was profound. Knights who had once trained to face armies, defend pilgrims, and endure harsh conditions were now confronting a more insidious adversary: the manipulation of fear, perception, and conscience. Torture created not only physical pain but moral and spiritual peril. A single confession, coerced or otherwise, could imperil the entire order. The knights understood this implicitly. Their knowledge, wisdom, and the artifacts in their charge were too important to fall into the hands of the unworthy. Each interrogation became a crucible, testing the limits of human endurance, ethical commitment, and spiritual resolve. The stakes were amplified by the political machinations that orchestrated these events. King Philip IV of France, aware of the knights' influence, wealth, and perceived autonomy, had designed a campaign that leveraged both force and public perception. By portraying the Templars as heretical and morally corrupt, he justified extreme measures, while simultaneously undermining their credibility in the eyes of the church, the nobility, and the populace. The interrogations were as much a performance for the outside world as a means of obtaining information. Every confession, real or coerced, could be used to shape narrative, delegitimize the order, and secure the king's political objectives. Even under these conditions, the Templars' discipline remained remarkable. Many knights endured suffering silently, communicating loyalty and resolve through stoicism and subtle gestures. The bonds forged through years of shared discipline, ritual, and study strengthened their capacity to resist both physical pain and psychological manipulation. Knowledge of the sacred inheritance, the responsibility of guardianship, and the awareness that betrayal would not only affect themselves but generations to come, provided an inner fortitude that made the knights extraordinarily resilient. Their silence and integrity became acts of profound defiance, a testament to the enduring strength of an order built upon secrecy, morality, and spiritual purpose. The interrogators, recognizing the knights' extraordinary resilience, intensified their efforts. Knights were isolated from comrades, subjected to extended questioning, and threatened with the destruction of sacred relics and texts. Yet even as pressure mounted, many continued to protect the secrets entrusted to them. The manuscripts, coded texts, and sacred artifacts that had survived centuries now depended upon the discipline, courage, and ethical clarity of those under interrogation. Each knight became a guardian not only of knowledge but of history itself, ensuring that the inheritance of Solomon's wisdom remained intact despite overwhelming adversity. The psychological warfare extended beyond the individual to the communal. Knights were forced to witness or hear of the suffering of their comrades, creating emotional strain and moral tension. The interrogators understood the power of fear and isolation, leveraging the natural bonds of loyalty and fraternity to destabilize the order. Yet these pressures often reinforced the Templars' internal cohesion. Those who resisted, drawing strength from their commitment and the ethical framework instilled over decades, became exemplars for others, reinforcing the culture of resilience and unwavering fidelity that defined the order. The torturous trials had another consequence. They exposed the extraordinary depth of the Templars' commitment to secrecy and duty. Knights who endured extreme suffering without betraying their mission demonstrated that their discipline extended beyond mere obedience or fear of consequence. It was rooted in a profound understanding of purpose, the preservation of sacred knowledge, the protection of artifacts, and the continuity of a lineage that had survived centuries of upheaval. This ethical and spiritual resilience ensured that even when confronted with the most extreme circumstances, the core mission of the order remained intact. In this crucible, the Templars' understanding of loyalty, morality, and responsibility was tested like never before. Each knight faced the paradox of vulnerability and power. Their bodies were constrained, their freedom threatened, yet their inner purpose, their knowledge, and their ethical framework provided strength beyond physical limits. Endurance became not only survival but a reaffirmation of the order's values. Every act of resistance, silence, or disciplined response was a reaffirmation of the Templars' identity, an assertion that knowledge and duty outweighed fear, coercion, and temporal power. The interrogations also highlighted the order's broader vulnerability to external forces. Wealth, autonomy, and secrecy, once sources of strength, became liabilities under a monarch willing to exploit fear, rumor, and coercion. The orchestrated campaign against the Templars demonstrated the fragility of even the most disciplined institution when confronted with coordinated political, legal, and psychological pressure. Yet the Knights' response underscored a critical truth. The endurance of knowledge, wisdom, and ethical commitment depends not only on systems and rituals, but on the integrity, courage, and moral clarity of those entrusted with stewardship. Ultimately, the trials of torture and interrogation became a defining moment for the Templars. They revealed both the extraordinary resilience and vulnerability of an order whose mission spanned centuries, connecting the fall of Solomon's Temple to the complex world of medieval Europe. The Knights' steadfastness under unimaginable pressure demonstrated that the preservation of knowledge and ethical duty could withstand even the most relentless human cruelty. Their courage, discipline, and fidelity ensured that the Order's mission did not perish entirely, leaving a legacy of endurance, mystery, and reverence for knowledge that continues to captivate centuries later. Even as individuals suffered, the collective purpose of the Order remained intact. The manuscripts, relics, and sacred traditions that had survived for generations were protected by the extraordinary ethical discipline and spiritual fortitude of those enduring interrogation. Knowledge, though threatened, was not lost. The Templars' response to these trials illustrated the profound relationship between moral integrity, courage, and the stewardship of wisdom. Their silence, resilience, and unwavering commitment ensured that the essence of the Order, the continuity of knowledge, the preservation of sacred artifacts, and the ethical cultivation of knights, survived, even in the face of extraordinary adversity. In reflecting on these events, it becomes clear that the Templars' ordeal was more than a political or legal crisis. It was a test of human character, moral fortitude, and the capacity to preserve knowledge under the most extreme conditions. Their endurance under torture and interrogation exemplifies a unique intersection of courage, discipline, and ethical responsibility. Each knight's choice to protect the Order's secrets, even at the cost of personal suffering, became a testament to the extraordinary values that defined one of history's most enigmatic and enduring orders. The dissolution of the Templars, orchestrated with meticulous precision by King Philip IV, was not merely the result of external pressure. It was a calculated destruction of an institution whose very existence represented both power and mystery. Across Europe, the Order that had once seemed untouchable now faced the inexorable machinery of political and ecclesiastical authority. Commanderies were sealed, treasures seized, and knights imprisoned under accusations that ranged from heresy to occult practice. The very skills, discipline, and secrecy that had allowed the Templars to endure centuries of peril now became factors that heightened suspicion and fueled a narrative designed to justify their eradication. The collapse of the Order was as psychological as it was political, a demonstration of how fear and envy can destabilize even the most resilient institutions. Philip's campaign against the Templars was characterized by methodical planning and strategic manipulation. He understood the power of perception and narrative. Public opinion was molded through the dissemination of stories about secret rituals, blasphemous practices, and moral corruption. Witnesses, coerced under torture, were used to provide testimonies that bolstered the king's claims, creating the illusion of a widespread conspiracy. The knights, whose lives had been dedicated to discipline, service, and the protection of sacred knowledge, found themselves fighting not only for survival but for the very truth of their existence. Every confession extracted under duress became a tool to delegitimize the order, undermining centuries of trust and devotion. The process of dismantling the order was systemic. Preceptories, often fortified and strategically positioned, were taken over with a combination of force and intimidation. Treasures and relics, the material symbols of the order's spiritual and intellectual authority, were seized, catalogued, and redistributed according to the king's design. Manuscripts and artifacts, many with origins tracing back to Solomon's temple or the secretive custodians of ancient wisdom, were hidden, destroyed, or absorbed into other collections. The practical effect was devastating. The Templars' tangible power was erased almost overnight, leaving the knights exposed, demoralized, and isolated. Yet even as the external structures of the order collapsed, the intellectual and spiritual legacy remained remarkably resilient. Knights who had been trained in secrecy, observation, and the careful preservation of knowledge understood that their mission extended beyond physical fortresses or material wealth. Manuscripts, symbols, and rituals had been encoded in ways that could survive confiscation and dispersal. Knowledge was preserved not only in objects but in minds, passed from mentor to apprentice, embedded in memory, and carried quietly into exile. Even in the face of political annihilation, the invisible essence of the order endured. The psychological impact on the knights was profound. They were confronted not only with the threat of death but with the dismantling of the order's identity. Decades, even centuries of disciplined training, spiritual cultivation, and ethical commitment were challenged by accusations that painted their lives and actions as morally corrupt and spiritually dangerous. Yet this very pressure highlighted the extraordinary resilience of the order. Knights relied on the principles that had been instilled through rigorous initiation, meditation, and study. The bonds of loyalty, ethical responsibility, and shared purpose provided an inner fortress that could not easily be breached by chains, accusations, or fear. Among the most striking aspects of the Templars' final years was their response to the seizure of knowledge and relics. While Philip sought to appropriate the material symbols of the order's authority, he could not entirely strip the knights of the intangible inheritance they carried. Initiates who survived imprisonment or execution had internalized principles, observations, and coded knowledge that could be transmitted discreetly. These hidden networks ensured continuity, even as visible power was shattered. Knowledge became the last and most enduring line of defense, a means of survival that transcended political and temporal control. The dissolution of the order also had profound implications for Europe. The sudden disappearance of the Templars left a vacuum in both military and financial spheres. Pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land no longer had the protection of a disciplined and reliable order. Kings and nobles lost the financial infrastructure and credit networks that had facilitated both commerce and warfare. At the same time, rumors, mystery, and speculation about the Templars' hidden knowledge and treasures intensified, giving rise to legends that would endure for centuries. The collapse of the order transformed it from a visible institution of power into an enduring symbol of secrecy, wisdom, and intrigue. The process of interrogation, imprisonment, and execution was both brutal and symbolic. Knights who had been trained to endure extreme conditions in battle and siege now faced the calculated cruelty of legal and psychological persecution. Torture, deprivation, and forced confessions were intended to break their will and extract information about treasures and hidden knowledge. Yet many endured, preserving not only secrets but the integrity of the order's mission. Their resilience under such extreme conditions reinforced the extraordinary discipline, loyalty, and moral fortitude that had defined the Templars for generations. Philip's campaign also revealed the fragile intersection between power and perception. The order's independence, secrecy, and mystique, which had been sources of strength for centuries, became liabilities in a political climate dominated by envy, suspicion, and ambition. The Templars' exceptional autonomy, coupled with their vast resources and esoteric knowledge, made them a target for a ruler determined to consolidate control. Their downfall demonstrates how institutions, no matter how disciplined or resilient, can be vulnerable when perceived as threats to centralized authority. Despite the systematic dismantling of their power, the Templars' legacy persisted in subtle, almost invisible ways. Manuscripts, symbols, and rituals survived in hidden networks, transmitted to initiates and scholars who could continue the preservation of knowledge in exile. Architectural motifs, coded texts, and allegorical teachings embedded in manuscripts allowed elements of the order's intellectual and spiritual inheritance to endure, influencing later secret societies and mystical traditions. Even in defeat, the Templars ensured that the essence of their mission, the safeguarding of knowledge, ethical cultivation, and spiritual insight, was not lost. The story of the Templars' dissolution illustrates the tension between human ambition and the stewardship of knowledge. Philip's campaign was successful in eradicating the visible structures of the order, yet it could not extinguish the principles, wisdom, and secrets that the Knights had internalized. The collapse of the Templars serves as a powerful reminder of the enduring strength of disciplined knowledge and ethical commitment, demonstrating that true influence often lies not in wealth, territory, or immediate authority, but in the careful preservation and transmission of wisdom across generations. Even centuries later, the dissolution resonates as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. The Templars' experience underscores the vulnerability of extraordinary institutions to political ambition, envy, and fear, while simultaneously highlighting the resilience that comes from discipline, ethical clarity, and the internalization of sacred knowledge. Their story is a testament to the idea that legacy is not solely determined by physical power or temporal success, but by the endurance of principles, knowledge, and moral responsibility across time and adversity. In the end, the dissolution of the Templars was both a tragedy and a preservation. While the order's commanderies were seized, knights imprisoned, and wealth redistributed, the intangible elements of the mission, the teachings, rituals, symbols, and wisdom, remained protected by those who had been trained to guard them. Knowledge, memory, and ethical discipline became the final fortress, ensuring that the essence of the order could survive, even in the face of overwhelming human ambition and political persecution. The Templars' collapse was a profound moment of transformation, shifting their presence from visible power to hidden legacy, a secret that continues to intrigue, mystify, and inspire to this day. The aftermath of the Templars' dissolution left Europe awash with uncertainty, whispers, and speculation. What had been one of the most disciplined, wealthy, and secretive orders in Christendom was now fractured, its members imprisoned, executed, or scattered across distant lands. Yet beneath the visible collapse, a subtler, more enduring story unfolded, one of preservation, concealment, and the survival of knowledge that had been safeguarded for centuries. The Templars' mission had never been solely about power or wealth. It had always been about stewardship of wisdom, sacred relics, and ethical principles passed down from the custodians of Solomon's temple. In this shadowed aftermath, the true test of their legacy began, for survival now required cunning, discretion, and patience beyond any battlefield strategy. Dispersed across Europe, surviving knights faced a world transformed. Their familiar commanderies had been seized, their treasures confiscated, and the legal and ecclesiastical apparatus had branded them as heretics. In every city, the specter of arrest, accusation, and execution loomed. Yet within these extreme constraints, the Templars' greatest assets, discipline, secrecy, and moral fortitude, became their tools for endurance. The scattered knights knew that their task extended far beyond immediate survival. They were entrusted with preserving knowledge whose loss could mean the end of centuries of accumulated wisdom. Every decision about where to hide manuscripts, whom to trust, and how to navigate treacherous political landscapes became a matter of life, legacy, and the continuity of human understanding. Some knights sought refuge in remote monasteries, cloisters, or rural estates, blending into the fabric of ordinary life while secretly maintaining their vows and practices. Others traveled further afield, reaching distant kingdoms or territories beyond the immediate influence of Philip IV. Wherever they went, they carried with them fragments of knowledge, manuscripts, encoded texts, symbols, and rituals that had survived the centuries and now became the lifeline of their continuity. Each knight was not merely a survivor but a living repository, tasked with internalizing, protecting, and transmitting the wisdom that had been entrusted to the order for generations. The challenge of concealment was immense. Monarchs, inquisitors, and opportunistic factions sought to discover, confiscate, or destroy anything associated with the Templars. Yet the order had been trained for such contingencies. Knowledge had long been encoded, rituals had been layered with protective symbolism, and manuscripts were hidden within walls, buried in the earth, or smuggled across borders. In exile, knights became masters of discretion, able to navigate unfamiliar societies while safeguarding secrets of immeasurable importance. Each movement, each action, was calculated to preserve the integrity of the order's mission while avoiding the lethal consequences of exposure. The preservation of manuscripts and relics was particularly critical. Scrolls that contained the distilled wisdom of centuries, coded instructions linking the Templars to the ancient Order of Solomon, and symbolic diagrams representing moral, spiritual, and philosophical principles were not merely texts, they were lifelines. Knights memorized content, replicated instructions, and concealed physical objects in ways that ensured survival even if the originals were seized or destroyed. Knowledge, in this context, became a living, dynamic entity, carried not only in ink and parchment but within the minds, discipline, and ethical awareness of those entrusted with it. The survival of the order's wisdom depended on human integrity as much as on walls, locks, or hidden chambers. Exile also demanded adaptability. The Templars had to navigate foreign lands, interact with unfamiliar political structures, and operate under constant threat. Their training in observation, discretion, and strategy became indispensable. Knights learned to identify trustworthy allies, establish secure channels for communication, and embed sacred practices into ordinary life in ways that avoided detection. Even rituals and meditative practices, once conducted openly within commanderies, were now adapted for secrecy, carried out in the privacy of cloisters, hidden chambers, or remote natural spaces. The art of concealment became both survival strategy and spiritual exercise, reinforcing the very discipline that had defined the order from its inception. The psychological toll of exile was considerable. Knights faced the loss of comrades, the dissolution of familiar structures, and the constant threat of betrayal or discovery. Yet the same factors that made them extraordinary, their ethical discipline, loyalty, and deep understanding of secrecy, allowed them to endure. The internalization of sacred knowledge, the cultivation of patience, and the adherence to principles that transcended immediate danger created a mental and spiritual resilience that was essential for survival. Every knight carried not only physical items but moral responsibility, ensuring that the legacy of the order was preserved despite the destruction of its external presence. The dispersal of the Templars also gave rise to a subtle network of hidden continuity. Across Europe, small groups of former knights, trusted allies, and sympathetic clergy maintained clandestine connections. Through coded letters, secret meetings, and discreet exchanges of manuscripts, knowledge continued to flow, ensuring that the ethical, spiritual, and intellectual inheritance of the order remained intact. This underground network became the backbone of survival, allowing fragments of wisdom, symbolic practices, and moral guidance to be preserved across generations, far from the prying eyes of kings or inquisitors. Legends and rumors played a critical role in both protection and mystique. The fear of Templar knowledge, whether exaggerated or grounded in reality, helped shield surviving knights and artifacts. Monarchs feared the supposed power and influence of an order that had once been formidable in both wealth and martial prowess. Stories of relics, sacred manuscripts, and secret rituals served as both deterrent and camouflage, creating a veil of legend that obscured the practical methods by which knowledge was actually preserved. In this way, myth became a tool of survival, protecting what was genuinely extraordinary through the very fear it inspired. The exile period also allowed the Templars' philosophy, discipline, and methods to influence other institutions and secretive movements. Elements of ritual, symbolism, and ethical training found their way into emerging mystical, scholarly, and fraternal networks. While the order as a formal entity was effectively dissolved, its principles, encoded wisdom, and ethical practices persisted, often hidden in plain sight. Knowledge once concentrated in commanderies now became diffuse yet enduring, ensuring that the legacy of the Templars, both mystical and practical, continued to shape the spiritual and intellectual landscape of Europe. In this period of concealment, the essence of the Templars' mission became clearer than ever. The Order's true power had never been mere military strength, material wealth, or political influence. Its resilience lay in the preservation of knowledge, the cultivation of ethical discipline, and the safeguarding of a lineage that stretched back to the ancient custodians of Solomon's Temple. Exile revealed the enduring capacity of the human mind, moral fortitude, and spiritual insight to carry forward wisdom even under extreme duress. The knights, scattered and persecuted, became living vessels, each one a guardian of secrets that could survive centuries of upheaval, destruction, and persecution. Ultimately, the period of Templar exile demonstrates a profound principle. Knowledge and ethical stewardship, when internalized and preserved, can endure beyond the destruction of physical structures and the dissolution of institutions. The Knights' ability to maintain secrecy, adapt to new environments, and continue their mission under duress ensured that the essence of the Order survived. Though the visible power of the Templars was obliterated, the invisible network of preserved wisdom, ritual, and ethical practice endured, leaving a legacy that continues to fascinate, inspire, and provoke wonder centuries later. The Templars' scattered survivors, though bereft of their formal structure, carried with them an inheritance that transcended material wealth or earthly power. What had been cultivated over generations, the careful preservation of knowledge, the encoding of wisdom, and the disciplined pursuit of spiritual and ethical insight, now became a lifeline, a hidden current flowing quietly beneath the surface of Europe. Exile forced the Knights to become masters of concealment and adaptation, moving through the shadows of society, blending seamlessly with ordinary life while safeguarding secrets that could shape the course of history if ever revealed. Every action, every interaction, every decision became both an act of survival and a continuation of a centuries-old mission. In this period of dispersal, the Templars relied on networks that were at once subtle and resilient. Former knights, sympathetic clergy, and trusted allies formed clandestine channels of communication, exchanging knowledge, manuscripts, and encoded instructions under layers of secrecy designed to withstand scrutiny. Letters were carefully coded. Meeting places were disguised as ordinary structures. Symbols embedded in architecture, ritual, or manuscript served as beacons to those trained to interpret them. Knowledge that had once been concentrated in fortified commanderies now flowed invisibly across borders and cities, preserved in the minds of those who understood both its value and its peril. The human element became the most reliable repository, for while material wealth could be seized, memory, discipline, and moral fidelity could not. The psychological and spiritual demands on the surviving knights were immense. Each Templar understood that failure to maintain secrecy, to safeguard manuscripts, or to act with ethical clarity could imperil centuries of preserved wisdom. The external world no longer recognized the Order's authority. Every encounter carried risk. Yet the internal discipline instilled over decades, the training in observation, secrecy, and spiritual reflection, provided a foundation for endurance. Knights relied on their ethical and mental fortitude, their ability to navigate fear, coercion, and the uncertainty of exile, transforming vulnerability into a crucible of resilience. Dispersal also allowed the Templars to preserve knowledge in unexpected ways. Manuscripts were hidden in monasteries, cloisters, or private libraries, often disguised as mundane religious texts. Rituals and teachings were encoded within allegorical stories, artistic motifs, or architectural patterns, allowing wisdom to survive even when physical artifacts were seized. The order's ethical and spiritual practices were carried forward in memory and instruction, creating a living tradition that transcended geography. These strategies ensured continuity across generations, safeguarding insights into human behavior, ethics, strategy, and the hidden principles that linked the physical and spiritual worlds. The dispersal of the order also illustrates the adaptability of human knowledge in the face of persecution. Knights who had once operated within a structured and centralized hierarchy now became itinerant guardians, blending into the fabric of society while maintaining the integrity of their mission. Each decision, from choosing a place to settle to whom to trust, was weighted with consequence. The survival of sacred knowledge required both prudence and ingenuity, a balance of caution and action that became a defining characteristic of the Templars in exile. Interestingly, the exile period amplified the mythos surrounding the Templars. Stories of hidden treasure, secret rituals, and arcane knowledge spread across Europe, creating an aura of mystique that simultaneously endangered and protected them. Monarchs and inquisitors, intrigued or fearful of what the knights might possess, were deterred by the legend as much as they were motivated by greed. The interplay between rumor and reality became a tool of survival, transforming fear into camouflage. The Templars' secrecy, once purely practical, now gained symbolic power, amplifying the impact of their legacy even as the order itself had been formally dismantled. The intellectual and spiritual dimensions of the Templars' work also persisted in exile. Knights continued to study manuscripts, engage in ritual practices, and meditate upon the symbolic frameworks that had guided their order for centuries. This intellectual and ethical cultivation was not mere survival. It was preparation for a world in which knowledge, moral discipline, and spiritual insight could influence events long after the collapse of their visible power. In exile, the Templars became custodians not only of objects and texts but of a living philosophy, one that emphasized the intertwining of action, contemplation, and ethical responsibility. Exile also reinforced the Templars' understanding of the fragility and value of human trust. Allies had to be carefully vetted, and every interaction weighed for potential risk. The cultivation of discernment became essential. Knowledge could not be shared indiscriminately, and even sympathetic parties could unwittingly jeopardize the mission. This heightened vigilance became a defining characteristic of the Templars' post-dissolution strategy, ensuring that the continuity of their hidden knowledge was maintained despite political, social, and personal dangers. Some of the knights turned to teaching, subtly passing down the ethical, intellectual, and spiritual disciplines of the order to select students and disciples. Knowledge was not broadcast or widely disseminated. It was entrusted only to those who could comprehend its depth, exercise discretion, and uphold the principles that had guided the order. In this way, the Templars' legacy became decentralized yet resilient, existing in fragments that could survive the volatility of politics, warfare, and human ambition. Their ethical and intellectual framework, encoded in memory, ritual, and careful instruction, became a seedbed for future generations of guardians, thinkers, and initiates. The Templars' hidden inheritance also adapted to the changing landscape of Europe. In the shadowed aftermath of the Templars' formal dissolution, a profound transformation took place. The order's physical structures were gone, its wealth dispersed, and its knights scattered, yet an invisible network of knowledge and influence endured. This period of clandestine existence became the crucible in which the essence of the Templars' legacy, discipline, secrecy, and the guardianship of ancient wisdom was preserved. Though the world saw only the collapse of a once powerful order, the true work of the Templars now shifted from the visible to the hidden, from the battlefield to the realm of ideas, symbols, and carefully guarded secrets. The dispersed knights became both archivists and initiators. Manuscripts, relics, and encoded texts that had survived centuries of crusades, conflicts, and political upheaval now required delicate protection. Some were hidden in monasteries and private collections. Others were smuggled to distant lands where inquisitors and monarchs could not reach them. Knowledge that had once been centralized in fortified commanderies was now distributed among trusted individuals, ensuring redundancy and continuity. Each knight, though isolated, carried a fragment of the greater mission, a living repository capable of preserving the essence of the order even under extreme duress. Secrecy, already the backbone of Templar discipline, became paramount. Every movement, every interaction, and every communication was calculated to avoid detection. Correspondence was encoded. Meetings occurred under the guise of ordinary activities, and the transmission of knowledge was meticulously controlled. Knights trained in observation and discernment used subtle gestures, symbols, and allegorical language to convey critical information without alerting outsiders. The genius of this approach lay in its simplicity and effectiveness. Even in exile, the order's core wisdom could survive, carried silently in the minds and practices of those who understood its value and risks. The psychological resilience required for this clandestine existence was extraordinary. Knights had to navigate constant fear of betrayal, surveillance, and political persecution while maintaining the integrity of the mission. They relied not only on their physical training and discipline but on the ethical and spiritual principles that had been cultivated through decades of rigorous initiation. The internalization of knowledge, combined with moral clarity and patience, allowed them to endure threats that were invisible yet as dangerous as any battlefield encounter. Each decision, whom to trust, where to hide, what to reveal or conceal, carried profound consequences for the survival of the order's legacy. Dispersal also allowed for an unprecedented evolution of the order's intellectual and mystical pursuits. Detached from the responsibilities of centralized administration, knights were able to focus on the study and transmission of hidden knowledge, including sacred geometry, symbolic systems, and the preservation of texts linking them to Solomon's temple. Encoded manuscripts and allegorical texts were refined, copied, and disseminated in a manner that protected their content while subtly extending influence. In this way, exile became both a challenge and an opportunity. The collapse of material power forced the Templars to innovate in the preservation and transmission of wisdom, ensuring that their mission could endure despite persecution. The hidden networks formed during this time were remarkable for their sophistication and subtlety. Knights maintained contact through intermediaries, coded letters, and trusted allies embedded in religious, academic, and political institutions. Knowledge flowed quietly, with redundancy built into every chain of transmission to safeguard against discovery or loss. Even when individuals were captured, interrogated, or executed, the broader system ensured that critical wisdom survived. This decentralized resilience reflected the Templars' foresight. The most important treasures were not gold, lands, or material wealth, but the principles, ethical frameworks, and encoded knowledge that could guide humanity beyond immediate crises. Legends surrounding the Templars' hidden activities grew alongside their dispersal. Tales of secret chambers, hidden treasure, and esoteric knowledge spread throughout Europe, capturing the imagination of monarchs, scholars, and mystics alike. While many stories were exaggerated, the underlying truth was undeniable. The knights had preserved a lineage of wisdom so potent that even whispers could inspire awe and fear. The mythos became a protective shield, deterring casual interference while enhancing the order's mystique. Through rumor, legend, and careful concealment, the Templars' influence extended far beyond their immediate physical presence. The exile period also illustrates the human dimension of resilience. Knights faced isolation, loss of comrades, and uncertainty, yet their sense of purpose and ethical responsibility provided a stabilizing force. Each knight understood that the preservation of knowledge, symbols, and sacred artifacts was a responsibility extending beyond personal survival. The mission was temporal and eternal, linking the past to the future, and imbuing daily actions with extraordinary significance. Even in adversity, the knights' commitment to duty and secrecy became an expression of both personal integrity and collective legacy. Among the most remarkable achievements of this clandestine existence was the preservation of ritual and symbolic practice. Practices once conducted openly within preceptories were adapted for secrecy, carried out in hidden chambers, private residences, and remote locations. Symbolic gestures, encoded chants, and allegorical readings became vehicles for transmitting knowledge to new initiates, ensuring continuity even when formal organizational structures were destroyed. This adaptation underscores the Templars' ingenuity, Even when visibility and authority were stripped away, the order maintained its spiritual and intellectual mission, preserving the principles that had guided it for centuries.